In the grand theatre of awful leadership, few performers deserve a standing ovation quite like Emperor Nero. This Roman disaster in a toga took the imperial stage in 54 CE and proceeded to put on what can only be described as history's most catastrophic one-man show. Picture this: Rome, the ancient world's greatest superpower, handed over to a teenager with the emotional regulation of a toddler and the artistic aspirations of a rejected theatre kid. What could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, absolutely everything. Nero started his reign promisingly enough. At just 16 years old, he became emperor with the help of his mother Agrippina, who basically ran a masterclass in helicopter parenting. For the first 5 years, under the guidance of his tutor Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, Nero actually seemed decent. He reduced taxes, gave slaves the right to complain against unjust masters, and banned capital punishment. It's like finding out that Voldemort had a brief phase of volunteering at animal shelters. But like many child stars, Nero's early promise quickly devolved into a spectacular train wreck. His first order of business: murder his own mother. Agrippina had become too controlling for his taste, and rather than attend family therapy like a normal person, Nero decided matricide was the answer. First, he tried an elaborate collapsing boat scheme, which failed when Mum turned out to be an excellent swimmer. Eventually, he just sent assassins. Mother-son relationships in ancient Rome were complicated, to say the least. With Mommy Dearest out of the picture, Nero's terrible decision-making accelerated faster than a chariot with no brakes. He kicked his first wife Octavia to the curb, then literally kicked her to death. He married his mistress Poppaea, who later died when Nero, in a fit of rage, kicked her while she was pregnant. Detecting a pattern here, the man had serious anger management issues and a disturbing fondness for kicking. But Nero's true passion wasn't violence, it was the arts, and not in a wholesome painting as a hobby kind of way. Nero considered himself the greatest artist of his age, a regular ancient Roman Kanye West minus the talent. He competed in the Olympic Games, and mysteriously won every event he entered, imagine that. Wrote poetry that made everyone cringe, and performed marathon concerts where audience members allegedly faked death to escape. People would literally pretend to die, rather than listen to another one of his lyre solos. That's not just bad reviews, that's audience members choosing fake mortality over his music. The emperor converted part of the palace into a private theatre, where he could force Rome's elite to endure his performances. Guards were stationed at the exits to prevent escape, and audience members were required to show their appreciation or face consequences. It was basically an imperial version of an open mic night, except you might get executed for checking your sundial too, obviously. Then came the most notorious moment of Nero's reign, the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. While Rome burned for 6 days, destroying 10 of 14 districts, rumours spread that Nero was playing his lyre and singing about the destruction of Troy. The emperor as a disaster tourist, composing his soundtrack to the apocalypse. While historians debate whether Nero actually fiddled while Rome burned, especially since fiddles didn't exist yet, the image stuck because it perfectly captured his self-absorbed nature. In the fire's aftermath, Nero did implement impressive urban planning reforms with wider streets and fire-resistant building materials, but he also seized prime real estate to build his outrageous Golden House Palace complex, complete with a 120-foot statue of himself. It's like rebuilding after a hurricane and deciding what the community really needs is a giant golden statue of you. Needing a scapegoat for the fire, Nero chose Rome's small Christian community. What followed was the first systematic persecution of Christians by Roman authorities. Believers were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, crucified, or set on fire as human torches to illuminate Nero's gardens at night. Even by ancient standards of cruelty, this was extreme. As Rome's economy tanked under the weight of Nero's extravagant spending, public opinion soured. Senators, soldiers, and citizens grew increasingly fed up with their emperor's theatrical antics and brutal governance. Provincial governors began revolting, and the Senate finally declared Nero a public enemy. In his final hours, as troops closed in, Nero famously lamented, "What an artist dies in me." Still obsessed with his performer's legacy rather than his catastrophic rule. Unable to face execution, he forced his secretary to help him commit suicide. His dying words perfectly captured his delusional ego. He wasn't concerned about the thousands he'd killed or the empire he'd mismanaged, but about the world losing his artistic genius. Nero's death at age 30 ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty and plunged Rome into the chaotic year of 4 emperors. His legacy was so toxic that subsequent emperors used Nero as shorthand for how not to govern. The Senate ordered his statues destroyed, his name scratched from monuments and his memory condemned, the Roman equivalent of being cancelled. What makes Nero truly fascinating isn't just his cartoonish villainy, but how his reign represents the perfect storm of absolute power, artistic delusion, and zero accountability. He embodied the dangers of unchecked narcissism in leadership centuries before psychology had terms for it. Essentially, Nero was that theatre kid who never faced rejection, given unlimited power and zero criticism. Looking back, Nero seems almost like a cautionary satire, a living warning about entrusting power to someone who values applause over governance. He treated Rome as his personal talent show venue while the actual empire burned, both literally and figuratively. In the pantheon of terrible rulers, Nero stands out not just for his cruelty, though there was plenty of that, but for his unique combination of artistic pretension and governmental malpractice. Ancient historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio Cassius painted Nero in the darkest possible colors, and while modern historians question some of their more outrageous claims, the core truth remains: Nero was a disaster of imperial proportions. He represents the ultimate example of what happens when leadership becomes performance art rather than public service. Perhaps the most incredible thing about Nero's legacy is that even after his death, pretenders claiming to be him popped up around the empire. Some people apparently thought, you know what would be great? If that guy who kicked his pregnant wife to death and used Christians as garden lights came back. These false Neros gained followings, speaking to both the chaos of the time and the strange charisma the man must have possessed. In the end, Nero remains the benchmark against which terrible leaders are measured. When we describe someone as Neronian, we're invoking a specific brand of self-obsessed, artistically pretentious, murderously unstable leadership that manages to be both tragic and absurd. He didn't just fiddle while Rome burned. He tried to make the burning into his own personal concert venue, then blamed the fire on someone else. Nero continues to fascinate us, not just as a villain, but as an archetype, the eternal warning of what happens when we give absolute power to those who are absolutely unprepared for it. In the reality show of history's worst emperors, Nero didn't just win the competition, he burned down the studio, killed the judges, and declared himself the greatest performer who ever lived. If you think your family reunions are awkward, imagine being part of the ancient Roman imperial family. Just when Romans thought they had seen peak dysfunction with Emperor Tiberius, along came his successor Caligula, a man who elevated governmental malpractice to an art form and made everyone nostalgic for the good old days of regular tyranny. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, mercifully nicknamed Caligula, stormed onto the historical stage in 37 CE with all the subtlety of a reality TV star given nuclear launch codes. His nickname Caligula actually means little boots, which sounds adorable until you realize those boots were soon walking all over Roman dignity, treasury funds, and basic human decency. Caligula started with a major advantage most terrible rulers don't get. People actually liked him. When he became emperor at age 24, Romans celebrated in the streets. They adored him as the son of beloved General Germanicus, and were desperate for anyone who wasn't the previous emperor, the reclusive and paranoid Tiberius. The Roman Senate practically threw the empire at his feet, and the public cheered as Caligula promised a fresh start. For about 6 months, Caligula delivered on that promise. He recalled political exiles, eliminated an unpopular tax, and hosted spectacular public games. Romans thought they had hit the imperial jackpot. It was like that brief honeymoon period when a new app works perfectly before the update that ruins everything. Then Caligula fell seriously ill. When he recovered, the Caligula who emerged was a different man entirely, or perhaps just the real version without the public relations filter. What followed was less a reign, and more a 4-year fever dream of power gone berserk. Let's start with the basics of Caligula's brand of madness. He declared himself a living god and demanded to be worshipped accordingly. Not content with claiming divinity for himself, he insisted his favorite horse, Incitatus, be treated as nobility. Contrary to popular myth, he probably didn't make the horse a senator, but he did give it a marble stable, ivory manger, purple blankets, and a staff of servants. Incitatus lived better than 99.9% of actual Romans, which says everything about Caligula's priorities. It's like giving your goldfish a corner office while your employees work in the basement. Caligula's spending habits would make a billionaire influencer blush. He blew through the entire imperial treasury, the equivalent of about $2.4 billion, in just 1 year. What did he spend it on? Parties, floating palaces, and a 2-mile pontoon bridge across the Bay of Baiae, which he rode across wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate just to prove a prophet wrong, who had said Caligula had no more chance of becoming emperor than riding a horse across the bay. Imagine spending the equivalent of a small country's GDP just for a cosmic "I told you so." His architectural ambitions were equally unhinged. He began extensions to the imperial palace that reached into the sacred temple of Castor and Pollux, effectively making the temple his vestibule. When asked why, Caligula reportedly replied that he wanted the gods as his doorkeepers. He also ordered statues of Greek gods decapitated and replaced with his own likeness. In the ancient world's version of extreme home makeover, he turned temples into monuments to himself faster than you can say narcissistic personality disorder. Caligula's foreign policy consisted mainly of bizarre stunts rather than actual governance. His most famous military campaign involved marching legions to the English Channel, declaring war on Neptune, and ordering soldiers to stab the sea and collect seashells as war trophies. It's hard to determine if this was madness, mockery of the military, or history's most expensive beach day. His personal life was a tornado of scandal. Caligula cycled through wives like seasonal wardrobes, and allegedly had inappropriate relationships with his own sisters, whom he treated as royal consorts in public. He would frequently insult senators by making them run alongside his chariot or serve him at banquets to reinforce their subservience. Speaking of banquets, Caligula turned dinner parties into theaters of cruelty. He laughed while torturing people during meals, and made parents watch the executions of their children right after forcing them to appear cheerful at his table. Imagine the world's worst dinner host who follows up a bad appetizer by murdering your family. His sadism extended to his wit. When a senator complimented him on a song, Caligula had the man dragged away and tortured, explaining that the man clearly had a throat problem if he could hear divinity in Caligula's voice, but couldn't express adequate praise. When tax revenues were discussed, he gleefully exclaimed that he was delighted to see how a single document could generate so much money, the implication being that he could simply execute wealthy citizens and seize their assets. Perhaps his most infamous financial scheme happened at a gladiator event. When there weren't enough criminals to face the beasts, he ordered his guards to throw a section of the spectators into the arena. The crowd's complaint: there weren't enough criminals being executed that day. Talk about giving the audience more than they bargained for. Caligula's administrative style can best be described as chaotic evil. He published tax laws in tiny writing on columns so high that citizens couldn't read them, then punished people for breaking these deliberately obscure rules. He appointed his horse to a priestly position, possibly to mock the religious establishment. He once called an emergency Senate meeting in the middle of the night, made everyone rush in fearing a crisis, and then performed a dance for them before dismissing them without explanation. For the Roman elite, Caligula was a walking nightmare who could switch from jovial to homicidal in seconds. He regularly humiliated senators, forced nobility to fight as gladiators, and executed people on the slightest whim. His favorite saying was reportedly, "Remember that I have the right to do anything to anybody." It's the ancient equivalent of typing in all caps that you'd like to speak to the manager, except the manager is also you, and you have execution power. What makes Caligula especially terrifying is that he seems to have been fully aware of how much he was hated. Unlike rulers who delude themselves into thinking they're beloved, Caligula embraced his villainous status. When crowds cheered for a team competing against his favorite at the races, he allegedly muttered, "I wish the Roman people had but a single neck," essentially expressing his desire to decapitate the entire population in one stroke. After less than 4 years of this madness, Rome had enough. In January 41 CE, Caligula was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard, senators, and court officials in a palace corridor. He received at least 30 stab wounds, and his Germanic guards killed several conspirators in retaliation. The assassins also murdered his wife and infant daughter, determined to erase his bloodline. His uncle Claudius, who had been hiding behind a curtain during the chaos, was found by the Praetorian Guard and promptly declared emperor, which turned out to be a surprisingly competent choice, given the circumstances. After Caligula's death, the Senate attempted to pass Damnatio Memoriae, officially erasing him from history by destroying his statues and removing his name from public records. They were only partially successful, which is why we can still marvel at his spectacular awfulness today. Historians have long debated whether Caligula was clinically insane or just extremely cruel and corrupt. Some suggest he suffered from epilepsy or another neurological condition. Others propose that his illness early in his reign caused brain damage that altered his personality. Modern historians have even suggested he might have been playing an elaborate sadistic joke on the Roman elite, deliberately acting as outrageously as possible to mock their pretensions and hypocrisy. Whatever the truth behind Caligula's behavior, his reign serves as a perfect case study in how quickly absolute power can corrupt absolutely. In just 4 years and 10 months, he managed to nearly bankrupt an empire, terrorize the populace, declare himself a god, possibly appoint a horse to religious office, attempt to wage war on the sea itself, and transform Roman politics into a deadly reality show where everyone was an unwilling contestant. The most disturbing part? Caligula's brief reign was just an opening act in a century that would see several more emperors competing for the title of worst ruler ever. Nero, Domitian, and Commodus would all take inspiration from his playbook of psychotic leadership, suggesting that Rome hadn't fully learned its lesson about the dangers of unchecked imperial power. 2,000 years later, Caligula remains the gold standard for governmental disaster, the ruler so bad that conspiracy to commit murder seemed like the reasonable option. His name has become shorthand for power-mad tyranny, proving that while empires may fall, truly spectacular failures achieve a kind of dark immortality. Caligula may have failed as an emperor, but he succeeded spectacularly at becoming a cautionary tale for the ages. If ancient Rome had yearbooks, Commodus would definitely have been voted most likely to ruin an empire while looking fabulous. After the relatively stable reign of his father Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who spent his free time writing deep thoughts instead of murdering people, Commodus burst onto the imperial scene like a frat boy who just inherited a casino. Marcus Aurelius was that rare thing in Roman history, a genuinely decent emperor who ruled with wisdom and restraint. His son Commodus, meanwhile, took one look at imperial responsibility and decided what Rome really needed was more gladiator matches starring himself. Imagine if your country was run by a combination of a WWE wrestler, a narcissistic influencer, and a murderous toddler. That's Emperor Commodus in a gold-plated nutshell. Born in 161 CE to Emperor Marcus Aurelius and Faustina the Younger, Commodus had a privileged upbringing as Roman royalty. While his father spent years defending Rome's borders and writing philosophical meditations, young Commodus was being groomed for leadership. Unfortunately, all that grooming resulted in a leader with fantastic hair but terrible judgment. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, 18-year-old Commodus became emperor and promptly decided that ruling was boring but partying was awesome. He swiftly abandoned his father's military campaigns, made a hasty peace with Rome's enemies, and rushed back to the capital to enjoy the perks of being emperor without all that tedious governing nonsense. For the first 3 years, Commodus ruled under the influence of his father's advisors, which kept his worst instincts somewhat in check. But after surviving an assassination attempt organized by his sister Lucilla in 182 CE, Commodus transformed from merely irresponsible to actively unhinged. Nothing sparks a villainous origin story quite like your own sister trying to have you murdered. The assassination attempt flipped a switch in Commodus. He executed the conspirators, including his sister, and embarked on a paranoia-fueled reign of terror. He began seeing enemies everywhere, and used this as an excuse to eliminate Rome's most distinguished citizens. Senators, nobles, and anyone with a hint of independent thought became targets. It was basically a very bloody version of The Apprentice, where getting fired meant literal death. While Nero fancied himself an artist and Caligula a god, Commodus decided he was the reincarnation of Hercules. Not content with metaphorical comparisons, he went full method actor with his divine persona. He dressed in lion skins, carried a club, and had statues of himself as Hercules erected throughout Rome. The emperor commissioned so many Hercules Commodus statues that Rome started to look like a theme park dedicated to his divine muscles. His Hercules obsession went beyond mere aesthetics. Commodus truly believed he possessed superhuman strength and divine powers. To prove this, he entered the gladiatorial arena to fight, though fight is a generous term for what actually happened. The emperor battled injured opponents, drugged animals, and helpless gladiators who knew that actually trying to win meant certain death. It was less blood sport and more bloody theatre, with a guaranteed outcome. These gladiatorial performances were not just occasional vanity projects, they became the centerpiece of his reign. He fought in the arena hundreds of times, charging the city an outrageous fee of 1,000,000 sesterces for each appearance. That's right, he made Rome pay him to watch him pretend to be brave. Imagine your president charging taxpayers millions to watch him play fight with increasingly unenthusiastic opponents. During these spectacles, senators and nobles were required to attend and cheer enthusiastically, unless they fancied a close-up meeting with the Praetorian Guard. One senator reportedly laughed at the emperor's fighting style and was immediately added to the next day's killing schedule. Nothing says insecurity quite like executing people for insufficient applause. The professional gladiators must have watched these imperial performances with a mixture of horror and second-hand embarrassment. Trained fighters were forced to make Commodus look good, which sometimes meant deliberately losing their lives to boost his ego. He claimed to have won 12,000 gladiatorial combats, a number so absurd it would require him to have fought multiple times every day of his reign. Even ancient propaganda had its limits. When not play fighting in the arena, Commodus found other ways to embarrass the empire. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, basically Commodusville. He renamed all 12 months of the year after his various titles. He renamed the Roman legions Commodian, and even tried to rename the entire Roman people. It was as if he was attempting to rebrand the entire classical world as a Commodus-themed amusement park. His administrative approach was equally disastrous. Rather than dealing with actual governance, he delegated everything to a series of corrupt favorites who proceeded to sell government positions to the highest bidders. This created an unprecedented level of corruption that destabilized the entire empire. Imagine putting your least responsible friends in charge of your country while you dress up as a mythological hero and stage fight with animals. Speaking of animals, Commodus had a particular fondness for slaughtering exotic beasts in the arena. He decapitated ostriches, clubbed rhinos, and killed elephants, lions, and bears, all pre-injured to ensure his success. Once he killed 100 lions in a single day, each carefully weakened beforehand. On another occasion, he shot the heads off ostriches and then walked among senators waving the bloody sword and smiling menacingly, silently threatening that they could be next. Nothing says stable leadership quite like threatening politicians with a freshly used sword while standing among exotic bird corpses. As Rome's economy tanked under the weight of his extravagance and mismanagement, Commodus found creative ways to refill the treasury. His favorite method was accusing wealthy citizens of treason, executing them, and confiscating their property. It was taxation through terror, and it turned Rome's upper classes into a terrified mess of people desperately trying not to appear too rich or too poor, too loyal or too independent. The public spectacles grew increasingly bizarre. In one legendary display of poor taste, Commodus gathered all of Rome's disabled and deformed citizens, gave them mock weapons, and battled them in the arena, clubbing them to death while dressed as Hercules slaying monsters. He charged the city another 1,000,000 sesterces for this grotesque performance. Even by ancient standards, this crossed every line of human decency. By 192 CE, Rome had suffered 12 years of Commodus, and pretty much everyone had had enough. His megalomania had reached new heights. He planned to start the new year dressed as a gladiator rather than a consul, a shocking break with tradition that would have officially degraded the office of emperor to that of a performer. For the status-conscious Romans, this was the final straw. The plot to remove Commodus came from within his inner circle. His concubine Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Latus conspired to assassinate him. First they tried poison, but Commodus vomited it up. Unable to wait for a second attempt with stronger poison, the conspirators sent in Commodus's wrestling partner Narcissus to strangle him in his bath. After 12 years of showboating, the self-proclaimed Hercules was taken out by his personal trainer. After his death, the Senate immediately passed Damnatio Memoria, officially condemning his memory and removing his name from public monuments. They were so eager to erase him from history that they toppled his statues within hours of his death. In their formal denouncement, they called him more cruel than Domitian, more foul than Nero, and suggested his corpse be dragged through the streets and thrown in the Tiber River. Even by Roman standards of political turnover, this was harsh criticism. Commodus's death ended the Antonine dynasty and plunged Rome into the Year of the Five Emperors, a bloody civil war that further destabilized the empire. His reign is considered by historians to be the beginning of Rome's decline, the point where the empire started its long, slow collapse. Not bad for a man whose primary concern was looking cool while stabbing drugged lions. What makes Commodus fascinating isn't just his over-the-top antics or his delusional self-image. It's how quickly he managed to undo generations of stability. His father had presided over what later historians would call the Pax Romana, a golden age of Roman peace and prosperity. Within 12 years, Commodus transformed that stability into chaos through a combination of neglect, corruption, and theatrical self-indulgence. The tragedy of Commodus is that he could have been something other than a catastrophe. Unlike many terrible emperors, he wasn't born into a completely dysfunctional family. He had the benefit of a philosopher father, a proper education, and a stable empire to inherit. He could have continued his father's legacy. Instead, he chose to be a mythological cosplayer with unlimited power and non-existent self-control. 2,000 years later, Commodus serves as a warning about the dangers of ego, inherited power, and what happens when performance replaces governance. He stands as a cautionary tale for all leaders who might be tempted to prioritize their personal brand over actual leadership. While most modern politicians might not claim to be the reincarnation of Hercules or fight in arenas, the basic lesson remains: when you treat ruling as a performance rather than a responsibility, everyone loses, eventually including you. Commodus may have failed as an emperor, but he succeeded spectacularly as a cautionary tale. In the end, perhaps that's his most lasting achievement, showing the world exactly how not to rule an empire. For that dubious contribution to political science, history remembers him, despite the Senate's best efforts to erase him from memory. If you've ever wondered what happens when you give absolute power to someone with trust issues, Emperor Domitian of Rome provides a textbook answer. The last ruler of the Flavian dynasty took paranoia to an art form, transforming the Roman Empire into a place where a wrong glance at the emperor could earn you a death sentence. And even the walls had ears, sometimes literally, thanks to his network of informants. Domitian might not have the name recognition of Nero or Caligula in the terrible Emperor Hall of Fame, but what he lacked in flamboyant madness, he made up for with methodical, calculating cruelty that left Rome's elite living in constant fear. Imagine an emperor who combined the micromanagement skills of an overbearing boss with the suspicion levels of a conspiracy theorist and the vindictiveness of someone who keeps a spreadsheet of everyone who ever wronged them. That's Domitian in a nutshell. Born in 51 CE as Titus Flavius Domitianus, he grew up in the shadow of his more successful father and brother. His father Vespasian rose from humble origins to become emperor after the chaotic Year of Four Emperors in 69 CE. His older brother Titus was the golden child, handsome, charming, and a successful military commander who helped suppress the Jewish revolt and conquer Jerusalem. Meanwhile, young Domitian was largely sidelined during his father's rise to power, given minor ceremonial roles while the real authority went to his brother. When Vespasian died in 79 CE, Titus became emperor and continued to keep his younger brother at arm's length from real power. Titus's reign was brief but popular, marked by his handling of multiple disasters including the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii. When Titus died suddenly in 81 CE, after just 2 years as emperor, rumors immediately spread that Domitian had hastened his brother's demise, perhaps by having him denied proper treatment during his final illness, or even directly poisoning him. Whether or not he murdered his way to the throne, Domitian finally had the power he'd been denied for so long, and he wasn't about to use it subtly. The new emperor quickly set about reorganizing the government to centralize authority in his own hands. Unlike his father and brother, who maintained the pretense that the emperor was just the first citizen working with the Senate, Domitian dropped the charade and embraced autocracy. He demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, had gold and silver statues of himself placed throughout the imperial palace, and insisted on elaborate court ceremonies that emphasized his divine status. Imagine being so insecure about your authority that you need people to literally call you a god to your face. It's the ancient equivalent of constantly telling everyone you have a very high IQ. In fairness to Domitian, his administration wasn't entirely a disaster. He was an efficient, hands-on ruler who took his administrative duties seriously. He strengthened the currency, enforced public morality laws, built impressive new structures in Rome, including a massive palace on the Palatine Hill, and generally kept the empire running smoothly. He was also a micromanager who insisted on personally overseeing even minor details of government, the kind of boss who would email you at 2 a.m. asking for updates on a routine project. His military record was similarly mixed. He secured the German frontier and ordered the construction of the Limes Germanicus, a series of forts, watchtowers, and walls that protected Roman territory. However, his campaigns in Britain and against the Dacians in modern Romania achieved limited success, despite his extravagant claims of victory. After a particularly unimpressive campaign, he staged a mock triumph in Rome, with slaves dressed up as German prisoners. It was the ancient equivalent of giving yourself a participation trophy and then throwing yourself a parade. Where Domitian truly distinguished himself as a terrible ruler was in his relationship with Rome's elite. From the beginning of his reign, he viewed the Senate with suspicion, believing not entirely without reason that many senators looked down on his family as upstarts and preferred the old aristocratic families. What began as tension evolved into open hostility and eventually a reign of terror against anyone perceived as a threat. Domitian's paranoia created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that permeated Roman high society. He regularly attended trials for treason himself, watching with an unnerving intensity that left the accused and judges alike wondering what he wanted to hear. He had informers everywhere, rewarding those who brought accusations against potential enemies. Casual comments, jokes about the emperor, or even reading the wrong kind of literature could be reported and used as evidence of sedition. As his reign progressed, Domitian's suspicion turned into outright purges. He executed or exiled senators, philosophers, and anyone else he perceived as a threat. One senator was executed for celebrating his birthday on the same day as a rebel general. Another was killed for having a map of the world in his house, which Domitian took as evidence of imperial ambitions. A historian named Hermogenes was executed for perceived slights in his writing, and the slaves who had copied the manuscript were crucified. Even Domitian's own cousin, Flavius Clemens, wasn't safe. He was executed on vague charges of atheism, which may have been a reference to Christian or Jewish sympathies. The emperor's living arrangements reflected his growing paranoia. He lined the walls of his palace portico with reflective stones so he could see if anyone was sneaking up behind him. He reportedly spent hours alone each day catching and stabbing flies with a stylus, leading one courtier to quip that at least there were no flies around when someone asked if the emperor was alone. It's never a good sign when your hobbies include stabbing insects while imagining they're your enemies. Domitian's personal life was as troubled as his public one. His marriage to Domitia Longina was tumultuous, including a period where he exiled her for an alleged affair, only to recall her shortly after. He had no surviving children with Domitia, but after the death of his niece Julia Flavia, with whom he reportedly had an affair, he deified her, elevating her to divine status. Nothing says healthy family dynamics quite like turning your deceased niece Lolta into a goddess. By 96 CE, after 15 years of Domitian's increasingly erratic and dangerous rule, fear of the emperor had transformed into a fear for Rome itself. The constant purges had eliminated many capable officials and created a climate where ability and integrity were liabilities rather than assets. Even the emperor's closest circle no longer felt safe, a feeling that proved justified when Domitian began executing even his most loyal officials based on the slightest suspicions. The end came from within his own household. On September 18, 96 CE, a group of conspirators, including court officials, senators, and even Domitian's wife Domitia, carried out an assassination plot. According to historical accounts, a freedman named Stephanus, who had been accused of embezzlement, pretended to have an injured arm and kept a dagger hidden in his bandages. After gaining a private audience with the emperor to discuss supposed conspirators, Stephanus struck, stabbing Domitian. Other conspirators rushed in to finish the job. The emperor, who had spent his reign seeing threats everywhere, finally encountered a real one. The Senate wasted no time celebrating his death, immediately passing damnation over memory, ordering his statues torn down and his name erased from public monuments. They selected the elderly Senator Nerva as the new emperor, beginning the period of the 5 good emperors that would give Rome a century of relatively stable and competent rule, quite a change from Domitian's paranoid micromanagement. What makes Domitian particularly interesting among Rome's bad emperors is that he wasn't obviously insane like Caligula or theatrical in his cruelty like Nero. His tyranny was cold, calculating, and methodical. He didn't burn Rome or make his horse a consul, or commit obviously deranged acts. Instead, he created a system of surveillance, intimidation, and selective punishment that allowed him to control through fear rather than outright terror. In this sense, Domitian represents a more modern kind of authoritarian, the ruler who maintains the functions of the state and even improves its efficiency while simultaneously undermining its institutions and creating a climate of fear. His administration worked well on paper. The provinces were governed effectively, the borders secured, and the economy managed responsibly. For ordinary Romans, life under Domitian might have seemed relatively normal. It was the elite who lived in constant fear, never knowing when an innocent comment or association might lead to ruin. Historians have debated whether Domitian's paranoia had some justification. There were indeed plots against him, and the senatorial class undoubtedly resented his authoritarian style. But like many rulers consumed by suspicion, Domitian created the very threats he feared by alienating potential allies and pushing people toward conspiracy as a means of self-preservation. The lasting image of Domitian's reign is perhaps best captured by the story that he once invited leading senators to a dinner party where everything, the walls, furniture, plates, and food, was colored black. The guests were seated next to gravestones bearing their names, served by naked, black-painted children who danced around them like spirits of the dead. After terrifying his guests into believing their execution was imminent, Domitian sent them home with the gifts that had been displayed on their gravestones. Whether this macabre dinner party actually happened or was invented by his enemies, it perfectly captures the psychological torture that characterized his reign, the deliberate cultivation of fear as a tool of control. 2,000 years after his assassination, Domitian serves as a reminder that tyranny doesn't always announce itself with spectacular displays of madness. Sometimes it arrives in the form of an administrator with a clipboard and a list of enemies, methodically crossing off names, while assuring everyone that it's all for the greater good. In the end, Domitian's legacy is not the buildings he constructed or the borders he secured, but the climate of fear he created, and the lesson that even the most vigilant paranoid can't watch his back forever. Just when Rome thought it had seen every possible variety of imperial disaster, along came Elagabus, a teenage emperor who makes modern rebellious phases look like seminary school. If the Roman Empire had a reality show called So You Think You Can Emperor, Elagabus would have been voted off in the first episode, then somehow returned as a wildcard contestant only to crash the entire production. Picture this. It's 218 CE, and Rome is about to be ruled by a 14-year-old Syrian priest with a penchant for makeup, silk robes, and religious practices so foreign they made traditional Romans collectively spit out their wine. Elagabus didn't just push boundaries, he catapulted over them while wearing golden slippers and waving incense. Born Varius Avitus Bassianus in 203 CE, the future emperor grew up in Syria as a hereditary priest of the sun god Elagabus in Emesa, modern-day Homs. His path to power came through his grandmother Julia Maesa, sister of a former empress who orchestrated one of history's most ambitious family promotions. After Emperor Caracalla was assassinated, Julia Maesa spread rumors that her grandson was actually Caracalla's illegitimate son, making him the rightful heir to the throne. It was basically the ancient Roman version of a paternity test scandal, except with armies and imperial destinies at stake. With his grandmother's political maneuvering and financial backing, the teenage priest found himself leading a successful rebellion against Emperor Macrinus. In 218 CE, at just 14 he became Emperor of Rome, proving once again that the Roman succession system had roughly the same level of quality control as a dollar store toaster. The young emperor arrived in Rome with all the subtlety of a glitter bomb in a library. He brought with him the sacred black stone that represented his god Elagabus and immediately set about making this obscure Syrian deity the chief god of the Roman Empire. Imagine if a new president tried to replace all national symbols with the logo of their hometown high school mascot. That's essentially what Elagabus attempted on a religious scale. The religious reforms alone would have been enough to alienate Rome's traditional power centers, but Elagabus was just getting started. He built a massive temple on the Palatine Hill for his god, and performed daily public rituals that involved dancing around an altar to the sound of cymbals and drums, wearing makeup and the flamboyant robes of a Syrian priest, rather than the dignified toga of a Roman emperor. The city's elite watched in horror as their teenage emperor twirled and gyrated his way through religious ceremonies that looked nothing like proper Roman worship. These weren't private eccentricities. Elagabus forced senators and other high officials to watch these ceremonies while he danced around the altar, moving backward so as not to disrespect his god by turning his back. The poor senators, trained in stoicism and dignity, had to witness their emperor performing what they saw as bizarre foreign rituals while dressed in extravagant Eastern clothing. It was like being forced to watch your boss's 4-hour interpretive dance recital, except your boss controlled the armies and could have you executed. Elagabus took his religious devotion to extremes that even the religiously tolerant Romans found shocking. He married a Vestal virgin named Aquilia Severa, an act considered horrific sacrilege since Vestal virgins were sworn to 30 years of chastity on penalty of being buried alive. When criticized, he simply replied that it was appropriate for a priest god to marry a priestess. It was the ancient equivalent of responding to a scandal with "you do you," while an entire empire collectively facepalmed. His personal life generated even more controversy. Elagabus cycled through wives with dizzying speed, 5 in 4 years, including the Vestal virgin mentioned above. But his most famous relationship was with a charioteer named Hierocles, whom he reportedly called his husband. According to historical accounts, Elagabus delighted when Hierocles beat him and proudly displayed the bruises as love marks. Ancient historians claimed he offered vast sums of money to any physician who could give him female genitalia, a detail that has led some modern historians to speculate about gender identity in antiquity. Though ancient sources were notoriously unreliable when discussing emperors they despised. While Elagabus's sexual and gender expressions have drawn much attention from both ancient and modern commentators, it's important to note that Roman objections weren't so much about his sexuality per se, but about the perceived reversal of proper Roman hierarchies. An emperor was expected to be dominant in all things. For the ruler of the world to take a submissive role with a charioteer was, to Roman sensibilities, a catastrophic inversion of the natural order. The Romans weren't shocked that he desired men, a common practice in ancient Rome, but that he allegedly preferred the passive role and flaunted it publicly. Elagabus's pranks and excesses would make even the most extravagant modern celebrities blush. He would invite dinner guests to sit on whoopee cushions, or the Roman equivalent. He might serve you painted rocks instead of food, or release lions and leopards into the room during the night, to terrify hungover guests awakening from a banquet. If you were really unlucky, you'd be on the receiving end of one of his more elaborate stunts, like being showered with so many rose petals from the ceiling that you actually suffocated under them, which allegedly happened to some unfortunate dinner guests. His approach to governance can be best described as completely non-existent. While Elagabus was busy with religious ceremonies and personal indulgences, his mother Suemias and grandmother Julia Maesa were the ones actually running the empire. For the first time in Roman history, women were permitted to attend Senate meetings, not because Elagabus was progressive, but because he couldn't be bothered to go himself and sent his mother as a proxy. It's like skipping class and having your mom take notes for you, except the class is running one of history's largest empires. If his religious practices and personal scandals weren't enough, Elagabus also had a flair for the kind of extravagance that made even wealthy Romans raise their eyebrows. He would wear shoes covered in diamonds, never wear the same clothes twice, and fill his swimming pools with rose water. He served meals of flamingo brains, parrot heads, and peacock tongues. He drove chariots pulled by naked women and scattered gold coins to the public, not out of generosity but to watch people scramble for them, sometimes getting trampled in the process. Perhaps his most infamous dinner stunt was serving his guests food made of wax, wood, and ivory, perfect replicas of actual dishes that left them still hungry after a visually sumptuous meal. When they went home famished, he would be rolling with laughter. It was basically an ancient version of those social media food videos where nothing is what it seems, except with added cruelty and imperial power. Even his grandmother Julia Maesa, who had orchestrated his rise to power, eventually realized her teenage emperor project had gone horribly wrong. Seeing the growing military and public discontent, she decided to cut her losses. She convinced Elagabus to adopt his cousin Alexander Severus as his heir, presenting him as a more balanced alternative, someone who respected traditional Roman values and didn't dance half-naked in public ceremonies. Soon after, Elagabus realized this arrangement was essentially a countdown to his own replacement. He attempted to have Alexander killed, but the Praetorian Guard, who had grown fond of the sensible young heir, protected him. Realizing that their emperor was now targeting the popular Alexander, the Praetorians decided they'd had enough of the Elagabus circus. In March 222 CE, the Praetorian Guard murdered Elagabus and his mother in a military camp. The 18-year-old emperor's brief but spectacular reign had lasted less than 4 years. The soldiers dragged his body through the streets of Rome before throwing it into the Tiber River, a final indignity for an emperor who had specialized in making Rome feel undignified. After his death, Elagabus received one of history's most thorough character assassinations. The Senate immediately ordered damnatio memoriae, erasing his name from public inscriptions. His religious innovations were dismantled, the sacred black stone sent back to Syria, and Rome tried its best to pretend the whole embarrassing episode had never happened. Whether Elagabus was truly as outrageous as ancient historians portrayed him remains debated. Roman historians like Cassius Dio and the author of the Historia Augusta were notoriously biased against emperors who challenged traditional values, and they may have exaggerated or invented some of his more outlandish behaviors. Some modern scholars suggest his religious devotion, while foreign to Roman sensibilities, may have been genuine rather than merely provocative. What's certain is that Elagabus fundamentally misunderstood the job of being Roman emperor. While the position granted enormous power, it came with equally enormous expectations about behavior, religion, and respect for Roman traditions. By flagrantly disregarding these expectations, Elagabus undermined his own authority more effectively than any external enemy could have. The irony of Elagabus's reign is that despite his religious fervor, he failed to understand that the emperor was already a religious figure in the Roman system, the Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the state religion. By trying to elevate his foreign god above Roman traditions, he wasn't just changing religious policy, he was attacking a fundamental pillar of Roman identity and imperial authority. Elagabus serves as a fascinating study in the limits of absolute power. Even an emperor could go too far when he violated Rome's core cultural and religious sensibilities. His short reign demonstrates that even in an autocratic system, rulers governed through a complex web of relationships and expectations. When those expectations were shattered too dramatically, even a teenager who theoretically commanded the world's most powerful military could find himself dragged through the streets and dumped in a river. 2,000 years later, Elagabus remains one of history's most colorful and controversial rulers, a teenage emperor whose brief reign shocked an empire, challenged gender norms, upended religious hierarchies, and ultimately proved that even in ancient Rome, there were some boundaries that couldn't be crossed without consequences. In the end, his greatest legacy might be showing that even absolute power has its limits, when it defies the cultural foundations upon which that power rests. If there were a how-to manual for speedrunning the destruction of your own dynasty, Emperor Yang of Sui would be its primary author. After inheriting a newly unified China from his father, Emperor Yang managed to take a strong, stable empire and drive it straight into the ground in just 14 years, an impressive achievement in imperial incompetence that few rulers in history can match. Picture a ruler with the grand ambitions of Napoleon, the self-indulgence of Marie Antoinette, and the strategic wisdom of someone who brings a spoon to a gunfight. That's Emperor Yang in a nutshell, a man whose massive construction projects, failed military campaigns, and luxurious lifestyle combined to create the perfect storm of imperial disaster. Born as Yang Guang in 569 CE, the future emperor grew up as the second son of Emperor Wen, founder of the Sui dynasty. Emperor Wen had accomplished something remarkable, reunifying China in 581 CE after nearly 3 centuries of division following the collapse of the Han dynasty. This achievement required military skill, administrative talent, and careful management of resources. His son Yang would demonstrate precisely none of these qualities during his own reign. The first red flag in Yang's story appears right at the beginning of his imperial journey. According to historical sources, he wasn't supposed to be emperor at all. His older brother Yang Yong was the crown prince, but Yang Guang allegedly conspired with his mother, Empress Dugu, to have his brother deposed. Some accounts even suggest Yang had his brother murdered after seizing the throne. Nothing says promising start to an imperial reign, quite like a bit of fratricidal ambition. Yang became Emperor Yang of Sui in 604 CE after his father's death, which some historians suspect he may have hastened. He inherited an empire with full treasuries, a growing economy, and relative peace, essentially the ancient Chinese equivalent of being handed a successful family business that's already turning a profit. Most heirs would try to maintain this success. Yang looked at this stable, prosperous empire and thought, you know what this needs? Megalomaniacal construction projects and unnecessary wars. His first grand scheme was rebuilding and expanding the Grand Canal, a massive waterway system linking the Yellow and Yangtze rivers to improve transport between northern and southern China. On paper, this wasn't a terrible idea. Better transportation could strengthen the empire. The problem was Yang's approach. Rather than building it gradually with careful planning, he mobilized over 5 million peasant laborers in forced labor campaigns. Workers died by the hundreds of thousands from exhaustion, disease, and starvation. Entire villages were depopulated as men were dragged away to dig canals. The Grand Canal itself eventually proved useful to later dynasties, but Emperor Yang wasn't building for practical future use. He wanted a luxury waterway for imperial pleasure cruises. He commissioned a fleet of massive dragon boats described as floating palaces, complete with multiple decks, luxurious quarters, and thousands of servants. His personal barge was reportedly over 200 feet long, decked out with golden dragons and jade ornaments, requiring 80 men just to pull it along the canal. It was essentially a super yacht in an age when most people lived in simple wooden huts. These pleasure barges weren't just for transportation. Yang used them for extravagant parties and to visit the many palaces he ordered constructed along the canal routes. One historical account describes how he took 100,000 artisans and workers to build temporary palaces whenever he traveled. Imagine forcing an entire city's worth of people to build you a disposable vacation home, only to abandon it after a brief stay. Not content with just one massive construction project, Yang rebuilt the Great Wall farther north and ordered the construction of a new eastern capital at Luoyang. The Luoyang Palace complex alone required over 1 million workers. When combined with his canal and wall projects, nearly half of the empire's adult male population was engaged in construction rather than producing food or goods. The resulting labor shortage and tax burden pushed ordinary citizens to the breaking point. Yang's taxpayers might have tolerated these expensive projects if they'd been getting good governance in return. Instead, they got a ruler who spent most of his time cruising on pleasure barges, visiting his harems, and planning his next architectural indulgence. While people starved, Yang reportedly maintained gardens where thousands of rare flowers bloomed in winter, heated by underground furnaces. His palace featured rooms that could be mechanically rotated to follow the sun, the ancient equivalent of climate control that consumed resources at a time when ordinary people were struggling to survive. If bankrupting his empire through construction wasn't enough, Yang decided to add disastrous military campaigns to his resume. He launched 3 invasions of the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo in 612, 613, and 614 CE. Each campaign was larger than the last, and each ended in spectacular failure. The first invasion allegedly involved over 1 million troops, numbers that stagger the imagination for pre-modern warfare. After initial successes, Yang's armies bogged down in sieges and were decimated by disease, starvation, and Korean counterattacks. Rather than learning from this failure, Yang doubled down, sending more massive armies in subsequent years with the same results. By the end of the third failed invasion, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers had died, and the empire's military strength was shattered. These Korean campaigns broke the back of the Sui military and emptied what remained of the imperial treasury. Soldiers who survived returned home to find their families starving due to heavy taxation and labor demands. The stage was set for rebellion, and rebellions indeed came, like a subscription service that automatically delivered a new uprising every month. As his empire crumbled around him, Yang responded with increased luxury and retreat into fantasy. In 616 CE, as rebellions spread across China, Yang decided the appropriate response was to take another pleasure cruise to Jiangdu, modern Yangzhou, in southern China. There he continued his life of excess while generals and local officials desperately tried to hold the empire together. The irony of Yang's canal-building obsession became apparent in his final days. The very transportation network he created allowed rebels to move quickly throughout the empire, spreading rebellion faster than his remaining loyal forces could respond. The infrastructure he built to strengthen imperial control instead facilitated imperial collapse. By 618 CE, Yang's authority had shrunk to just the area around his palace in Jiangdu. Even his personal guards had had enough of his disastrous leadership. Yuan Huaji, the son of a general who had died in the Korean campaigns, led members of the imperial guard in a coup. They broke into the emperor's quarters and strangled him in his bath, an undignified end for a ruler obsessed with imperial grandeur. The aftermath of Yang's death was swift and decisive. The Sui dynasty, which his father had established with such promise, collapsed completely. Yang's 16-month-old grandson was briefly declared emperor before being deposed, and China fragmented into competing powers before the Tang dynasty reunified the country. A dynasty that should have ruled for centuries lasted barely 37 years, with Yang personally responsible for destroying it in just 14. What makes Emperor Yang such a fascinating figure in the pantheon of terrible rulers is the sheer scale of his self-destruction. He inherited perhaps the most powerful empire on earth and systematically dismantled it through a combination of megalomania, strategic incompetence, and self-indulgence. It's like watching someone win the lottery and then light the money on fire while insisting this is a brilliant financial strategy. Chinese historians were not kind to Emperor Yang's memory. The official histories portrayed him as one of China's worst tyrants, alongside notorious figures like King Jie of the Shao dynasty and King Zhou of Shang. Later dynasties used him as a cautionary tale of how not to rule. For centuries after his death, his name was synonymous with tyranny, extravagance, and failure. Some modern historians have attempted to rehabilitate Yang's image somewhat, pointing out that the Grand Canal did ultimately benefit China, and that historical accounts written under the Tang dynasty may have exaggerated his flaws to legitimize their own rule. However, even the most generous reassessment can't erase the basic facts. He inherited a unified, prosperous empire and left it in shambles. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Yang's reign is how it illustrates the delicate balance between ambitious infrastructure development and sustainable governance. Projects like the Grand Canal could have been his greatest legacy if executed with patience and concern for his subjects. Instead, his insistence on immediate results regardless of human cost transformed potential achievements into catastrophic failures. Emperor Yang's story also demonstrates how quickly even the most powerful empires can collapse when leadership fails. The Sui dynasty reunified China after centuries of division, creating administrative systems that would serve as models for later dynasties. Yet all this progress unraveled in just over a decade under Yang's misrule. A sobering reminder that even the greatest political achievements can be undone by a single incompetent ruler. In the end, Emperor Yang of Sui stands as one of history's most efficient dynasty destroyers, a ruler who took the stable empire his father built and ran it into the ground with record-breaking speed. His legacy serves as a warning about the dangers of prioritizing monumental projects and personal luxury over the basic needs of the people. 2,000 years later, the lesson remains clear. Even the most powerful ruler ultimately depends on the support of those they govern. When that support collapses, no amount of grand canals, pleasure barges, or palace complexes can save you from the judgment of history, or from being strangled in your own bathtub by your disgusted bodyguards. In the grand tradition of comeback stories, most feature an underdog rising against the odds through hard work and determination. Then there's Justinian II, whose comeback involved getting his nose chopped off, spending a decade in exile, returning with an army of foreigners, and taking revenge on everyone who wronged him. It's less inspirational Hallmark movie and more Game of Thrones episode directed by Quentin Tarantino. If you think modern politics is cutthroat, the Byzantine Empire would like a word, preferably whispered from behind a heavily guarded door while checking for poison in your wine. Justinian II played the Byzantine Game of Thrones during the late 7th century, and what he lacked in diplomatic finesse, he made up for with sheer stubborn refusal to stay overthrown. Born in 669 CE to Emperor Constantine IV, young Justinian grew up knowing he was destined for the throne. He became emperor at 16 when his father died in 685, inheriting an empire facing threats from the expanding Arab Caliphate and the Bulgar Kingdom. Most teenagers would be intimidated by such responsibilities. Justinian II decided the best approach was maximum aggression in all directions simultaneously. His first reign started promisingly enough. Justinian secured a peace treaty with the Umayyad Caliphate that was actually favorable to the Byzantines, recovering several territories including parts of Cyprus, Armenia, and Georgia. In a normal success story, this would be the part where the young ruler builds on his diplomatic victory and ushers in an era of peace and prosperity. Instead, Justinian chose the path of most resistance. Despite the peace treaty with the Arabs that included a revenue-sharing agreement for territories in Cyprus, Armenia, and Iberia, Justinian decided he didn't feel like sharing anymore. He resettled Cypriot Christians to the Hellespont region, leaving their homes empty, and stopped paying the Arabs their agreed portion of taxes. It was the diplomatic equivalent of agreeing to split a pizza, then eating the whole thing while making direct eye contact. His foreign policy elsewhere showed similar subtlety. He broke a treaty with the Bulgars and launched an invasion that initially succeeded, but ultimately ended in a devastating Byzantine defeat at the Battle of Sebastopolis. Many of his Slavic troops deserted to the enemy mid-battle, which should have been a hint about his leadership skills. When soldiers would rather join the enemy than keep fighting for you, it might be time for some self-reflection. The self-reflection wasn't in Justinian's toolbox. Instead, his ruling style could best be described as extortion with imperial branding. He appointed 2 ministers, Theodotus, a former monk turned finance minister, and Stephen the Persian, who implemented a taxation system so brutal it made modern IRS audits look like spa treatments. They imposed heavy taxes on the urban population, rich landowners, and the peasantry alike, and used torture to extract payment. It wasn't just about money, though. Justinian had a particular talent for alienating literally every segment of society. The aristocracy hated his taxation. The urban population resented his oppression. The army was demoralized by his military failures. The church was upset by his religious policies. It's almost impressive to achieve such universal unpopularity without the help of social media. The breaking point came in 695 CE. After a decade of his increasingly tyrannical rule, a general named Leontius led a coup. Justinian was captured, but instead of the usual execution, Leontius opted for something more creative. Justinian's nose was cut off, an act called rhinocopia, and his tongue was partially cut, glossotomy. In Byzantine culture, this mutilation disqualified him from the throne, as the emperor was supposed to be physically perfect as God's representative on earth. It was image-conscious politics taken to a gruesome extreme. The newly noseless ex-emperor was then exiled to Cherson in Crimea in modern Ukraine, a remote outpost of the empire. Most would-be rulers would take the hint: loss of nose equals sign, loss of imperial ambitions. Justinian, however, was built differently. His mutilation, rather than humbling him, transformed whatever personality flaws he had before into weapons-grade bitterness and a thirst for revenge that would make the Count of Monte Cristo look like an amateur. Life in exile didn't improve Justinian's sunny disposition. When he discovered that the authorities in Cherson were plotting to turn him over to the new emperor, by this time Leontius had himself been overthrown by Tiberius III. Justinian fled to the Khazar Khaganate north of the Black Sea. There he somehow managed to charm the Khazar ruler, Busir, who gave him his sister in marriage. She took the Byzantine name Theodora, and Justinian settled into life among the Khazars. But happily ever after wasn't in Justinian's plans. When he learned that Tiberius III was pressuring the Khazars to eliminate him, Justinian escaped assassination attempts with the help of his wife. The couple fled to the Bulgar Khan Tervel. Yes, the same Bulgars that Justinian had previously double-crossed. It's like asking your ex to help you move after you cheated on them, burned their house down and insulted their mother. Remarkably, Khan Tervel agreed to help, providing Justinian with 15,000 horsemen in exchange for gold, gifts, and a daughter in marriage. With this army, Justinian marched on Constantinople in 705 CE. After a decade in exile, the man without a nose was about to pull off one of history's most improbable comebacks. Initially unable to enter the heavily fortified city, Justinian and a small group of followers allegedly crawled through an aqueduct or drainage pipe to get inside the walls. Once there, he rallied enough support to retake the throne, capturing Tiberius III. The restoration of Justinian II to the Byzantine throne after 10 years of mutilated exile remains one of history's most unlikely political comebacks. It's like finding out the villain you threw off a cliff in the first movie not only survived but spent the entire sequel getting stronger and collecting allies. Now came the part Justinian had been dreaming about for a decade: revenge. Sweet, excessive, creative revenge. Emperor Tiberius III and his predecessor Leontius were dragged to the hippodrome in chains. Before executing them, Justinian used them as literal footstools, placing his feet on their necks while watching chariot races. It was the 8th century equivalent of posting embarrassing photos of your enemies on Instagram before ruining their lives. The executions were just the appetizer in Justinian's revenge feast. He ordered wholesale slaughter of the aristocratic families who had opposed him, executing military leaders, senators, and officials. The patriarch Callinicus, who had crowned both usurpers, had his eyes gouged out. For the next 6 years, Justinian conducted a reign of terror against anyone even suspected of having supported the rulers who replaced him. During all this, Justinian had a slight image problem, namely, he still didn't have a nose. His solution? A solid gold prosthetic nose. Some sources suggest it might have been made of silver, or even a combination of gold and precious stones. Either way, he became known as Justinian Rhinomytos, Justinian the Slit-Nosed, which isn't the kind of royal nickname that suggests a calm, forgiving personality. His second reign was even more disastrous than his first. He continued his predilection for breaking treaties, double-crossing allies, and generally making enemies everywhere. He launched a failed expedition against the Arabs at Cherson, the city of his exile. When that went poorly, he ordered the murder of local officials and nobles. When his fleet was destroyed by storms on the return journey, he responded by ordering another, more thorough extermination of the Cherson population. This final atrocity proved too much. The soldiers sent to carry out this massacre rebelled and proclaimed their commander Bardanes as Emperor Philippicus. Justinian was at Sinope in modern Turkey when he learned of this latest rebellion. He tried to return to Constantinople, but was abandoned by his remaining supporters. In December 711 CE, Justinian was captured and executed. His head was cut off and sent to Constantinople, then on to Rome and Ravenna as proof of his death. His 6-year-old son and co-emperor, Tiberius, who had been ruling in Constantinople, was dragged from sanctuary in a church and murdered, extinguishing the Heraclian dynasty that had ruled Byzantium for a century. What makes Justinian II fascinating isn't just his noseless comeback or his creative revenge tactics, but what he represents about power and personality. His stubborn refusal to change or adapt, his vindictiveness, and his self-destructive pursuit of vengeance ultimately destroyed him and his dynasty. He's a cautionary tale about how even the most impressive comeback can be wasted if you haven't learned anything from failure. Historians have often speculated about Justinian's mental state, with some suggesting he may have suffered from conditions that affected his judgment and temperament. Whether his behavior stemmed from mental illness, the trauma of mutilation and exile, or simply an extraordinarily vindictive personality, the results were the same: a reign characterized by cruelty, paranoia, and ultimately, catastrophic failure. Justinian's legacy went beyond his personal story. His disastrous rule weakened the Byzantine Empire at a critical moment when it faced expanding Arab power. The instability he created led to a period of rapid imperial turnover, with the empire seeing a parade of short-lived emperors in the years following his death. It would take the rise of the Isaurian dynasty under Leo III to stabilize the situation. The story of Justinian II reminds us that in leadership, a desire for revenge makes for terrible policy. His obsession with punishing his enemies became more important than actually governing effectively. He couldn't see past his personal grudges to the bigger picture of imperial security and prosperity. It turns out that living well truly is the best revenge, certainly better than losing your nose, your empire, and ultimately your head in the pursuit of getting even. 2 centuries after his death, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenetus would write that Justinian II had a tyrannical disposition and brought about many evils to his subjects. It's hard to imagine a clearer example of how personal flaws, magnified by absolute power and marinated in the bitterness of exile, can transform a ruler from merely bad to catastrophically terrible. In The Emperor Without a Nose, we find a timeless lesson about the dangers of vengeance and the importance of knowing when to let go of past wrongs, a lesson that remains as relevant in today's boardrooms and political arenas as it was in the glittering, treacherous world of Byzantine power. History has no shortage of terrible rulers, but most of them at least had the decency to limit their awfulness to one country. Not Leopold II of Belgium. This mustache-twirling villain of the Victorian era decided that being king of a small European nation wasn't enough of a power trip, so he acquired his own personal colony in Africa and proceeded to run it like a nightmare corporation with a body count in the millions. If there were an evil overlord Olympics, Leopold would take gold in the category of hiding atrocities behind humanitarian pretenses. He managed to convince the world he was on a noble mission to bring civilization to Africa while simultaneously treating an entire country as his private ATM, with withdrawal fees paid in human lives and severed hands. Born in 1835 to the Belgian royal family, Leopold grew up with the kind of entitlement that only comes from being told since birth that you're inherently better than everyone else. He became King Leopold II in 1865, inheriting a small, relatively new European nation that lacked the imperial swagger of Britain, France, or Germany. For most monarchs, ruling a peaceful, prosperous country would be enough. For Leopold, it was like being given a Honda when all his friends had Ferraris. Leopold looked at the European colonial powers carving up Africa and thought, "Hey, I want a slice of that continental cake." The problem? Belgium wasn't powerful enough to join the colonial party as a nation. The solution? Create a private colony that belonged to him personally, not to Belgium. It was like being denied a company credit card and deciding to start your own company instead, except with sovereign territory and millions of human lives. His opportunity came with the European fascination with African exploration. Leopold established an organization with the impressively humanitarian-sounding name International African Association. Its stated goals were to bring civilization, end the Arab slave trade, and open the continent to legitimate commerce. In reality, it was the colonial equivalent of naming your invasion force the Department of Hugs and Friendship. Leopold hired the famous explorer Henry Morton Stanley of Dr. Livingstone, I presume, fame to establish treaties with local leaders in the Congo Basin. These treaties were masterpieces of colonial trickery. While native leaders thought they were signing friendship agreements, they were actually signing away their land and their people to Leopold's personal control. Imagine signing what you think is a gym membership, only to discover you've actually agreed to become the treadmill. At the 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference, where European powers gathered to decide how to divide Africa among themselves, without inviting any Africans, of course, Leopold's impressive humanitarian rhetoric won the day. The major powers agreed to give him personal control of a territory 76 times larger than Belgium. The Congo Free State was born, free in name only, as it would soon become one of the most exploitative regimes in colonial history. Once he secured international recognition, Leopold's mask slipped faster than a cheap Halloween costume. The humanitarian rhetoric was replaced by a single-minded focus on extracting as much wealth as possible from the Congo, particularly ivory and later rubber. His administration established a brutal system that transformed an entire country into a forced labor camp. The rubber boom of the 1890s revealed the true horror of Leopold's rule. As demand for rubber soared with the invention of pneumatic tires, Leopold saw an opportunity to make a fortune. The Congo was rich in rubber vines, and local people were forced to collect this valuable resource under a quota system that defined sadistic efficiency. Here's how it worked. Villagers were required to provide a set amount of rubber. Failure to meet quotas was punishable by death, mutilation, or the taking of women and children as hostages. Leopold's force publique, colonial army, would raid villages that failed to meet quotas, killing people and cutting off their hands as proof they had used bullets effectively. Yes, you read that correctly. They collected human hands as administrative evidence. Sometimes soldiers would cut off hands from living people to meet their own quotas when they hadn't used their bullets for killing. Children's hands were taken. Villages that resisted were wiped out entirely. It was a system so unimaginably cruel that even other colonial powers, not exactly known for their gentle touch, were horrified. Leopold managed this atrocity factory from the comfort of his palace in Belgium, never once visiting the Congo Free State. He treated the massive territory as a business, referring to it as ma belle affaire, my beautiful business. While Congolese people were having their hands cut off for not collecting enough rubber, Leopold was using his Congo profits to build elaborate palaces, monuments, and public works in Belgium, literally constructing his legacy with blood money. The scale of death under Leopold's rule was staggering. While precise numbers are impossible to determine, Leopold made sure of that by destroying many records. Modern historians estimate that the population of the Congo was reduced by half during his rule. That's approximately 10 million people who died from killings, starvation, disease, and plummeting birth rates due to the devastation of communities. It was a corporate genocide where people weren't killed for their ethnicity, but for their failure to generate sufficient profit. How did he get away with this for so long? Partly through elaborate public relations, Leopold hired defenders to portray him as a humanitarian fighting Arab slave traders. He controlled information coming out of the Congo and cultivated an image of a benevolent monarch bringing civilization to Africa. It was gaslighting on an imperial scale. The truth eventually came out thanks to one of history's earliest international human rights campaigns. The unlikely heroes of this story include E.D. Morel, a British shipping clerk who noticed that ships returning from Congo were full of valuable resources but never carried trade goods to pay for them, only weapons and ammunition. Roger Casement, a British consul who documented atrocities, and missionaries who witnessed the horror firsthand. These whistleblowers formed the Congo Reform Association and used a new technology, photography, to document the atrocities. Images of children with severed hands and stories of unimaginable cruelty began circulating in European and American newspapers. Mark Twain wrote a scathing satire called King Leopold's Soliloquy. Even in an age accustomed to colonial brutality, the Congo Free State stood out as exceptionally horrific. As international pressure mounted, Leopold launched a counteroffensive of spin and denial that would impress modern PR firms. He established a hand-picked commission that, surprisingly, still found evidence of atrocities. When that didn't work, he burned archives. 8 days of document destruction before handing the Congo over to the Belgian government in 1908. The transition from Leopold's private colony to Belgian Congo wasn't motivated by humanitarian concerns, but by Leopold's massive debt. He had mortgaged his colony to the limit and faced financial ruin. The Belgian government paid him 50 million francs as a token of gratitude for his generosity in giving them his colony. It's like getting caught running a criminal enterprise and being paid a severance package for agreeing to stop. Leopold died in 1909, a year after losing his colony but still a wealthy man. Before his death, he was booed by the Belgian public, not for his African atrocities, which many Belgians remained ignorant about, but for scandals involving his young mistress. In his final years, he grew increasingly eccentric, obsessed with his legacy, and determined to prevent his estranged daughters from inheriting his wealth. He created a charitable foundation to hold his remaining Congo wealth, bypassing his daughters with what might be history's most blood-soaked trust fund. The Belgian government removed many statues of Leopold after his death, not out of shame but because they were just too expensive to maintain. In a twist of historical irony, many of those statues have recently been removed again or vandalized as the world finally acknowledges the scale of Leopold's crimes. What makes Leopold II particularly disturbing among history's terrible rulers is the sheer contrast between appearance and reality. While dictators like Caligula or Nero made no secret of their cruelty, Leopold created an elaborate facade of philanthropy to hide industrial-scale human exploitation. He never set foot in the Congo, never witnessed the suffering he caused, and maintained until his death that he had done a great service to Africa. His legacy is a dark reminder of how colonialism's civilizing mission often masked raw exploitation, and how easily international opinion could be manipulated before the age of mass communication. Leopold created the template for modern resource extraction that enriches distant shareholders while leaving local populations impoverished, just with more severed hands and direct violence than most modern corporations can get away with. Perhaps most disturbing is how long it took for Leopold's true legacy to be widely acknowledged. For much of the 20th century, Belgian schoolchildren were taught that Leopold II was a great humanitarian who brought civilization to Africa. Streets, squares, and monuments still bear his name. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians like Adam Hochschild brought renewed attention to the Congo atrocities with books like King Leopold's Ghost. 2 lessons stand out from Leopold's reign of terror. First, beware of powerful men who justify their actions with humanitarian rhetoric, especially when there's profit to be made. Second, history's most effective monsters aren't always the ones who personally wield the knife, but those who create systems of cruelty while maintaining plausible deniability. Leopold II never faced justice for his crimes. He died a wealthy man in his palace, having successfully laundered both his reputation and his blood money into grand Belgian architecture that tourists admire to this day. But as statues of Leopold continue to fall across Belgium, history is finally delivering its verdict on the king who owned a country and treated its people as expendable resources in his beautiful business. Some rulers earn their terrifying nicknames through consistent awfulness across their entire reign. Then there's Ivan IV of Russia, who spent the first half of his rule as a surprisingly decent king before taking a hard left turn into Crazy Town, leaving historians forever debating whether to file him under great reformers or history's greatest monsters. Spoiler alert, it's definitely both. Ivan the Terrible holds the distinction of being Russia's first official Tsar, and boy did he set the bar for dramatic leadership. Imagine if your country's foundational ruler had the administrative brilliance of a seasoned CEO combined with the impulse control of a toddler who missed nap time and the vengeful streak of a soap opera villain. That's Ivan in a fur-lined, jewel-encrusted nutshell. Born in 1530 to Grand Prince Vasily III of Moscow and Elena Glinskaya, young Ivan had what therapists today would call an adverse childhood experience bingo card. His father died when he was 3, his mother likely died of poison when he was 8, and he spent his childhood being neglected and humiliated by power-hungry boyars, Russian nobles who ran the government while treating the boy prince as an afterthought. Little Ivan's childhood hobbies reportedly included throwing animals off towers and torturing small creatures. Never a great sign in a future leader, but in his defense he was surrounded by brutal nobles plotting against each other while ignoring the rightful heir to the throne. The boy learned early that power was the only protection against cruelty, a lesson that would shape his entire approach to leadership. At age 16, Ivan pulled a power move that shocked everyone. He suddenly announced his intention to be crowned not just as Grand Prince like his predecessors, but as Tsar of all Russia, claiming the imperial title previously used by Byzantine emperors. In January 1547, he was officially crowned, effectively declaring Russia an empire and himself its supreme ruler. Imagine a teenager not just demanding the car keys but announcing he's now running the entire car company. The surprising part? Young Ivan initially ruled pretty well. He assembled a group of advisors called the Chosen Council and implemented a series of significant reforms. He reorganized the military, created Russia's first standing army, the Streltsy, established a functional government bureaucracy, reformed the law code, and even limited the powers of the boyars who had made his childhood so miserable. Under his early leadership, Russia expanded dramatically. He conquered the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, bringing large swaths of territory under Russian control and opening the path to Siberia. He established trade with England, bringing Russia more fully into European diplomatic circles. He even showed interest in bringing printing to Russia and supported the construction of one of Russia's most recognizable buildings, St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow's Red Square. For the first decade or so of his reign, Ivan seemed to be setting Russia on the path to becoming a modern European power. Then everything changed in 58, when Ivan attacked Livonia, modern-day Estonia and Latvia, beginning the disastrous 24-year Livonian War. This costly conflict against Poland, Lithuania, Sweden and Denmark bogged down in a stalemate that drained Russian resources and produced few lasting gains. It was like watching someone start a home renovation project with grand plans, only to end up with a half-demolished house, an empty bank account, and 3 angry neighbors. But the real turning point came in 1560, when Ivan's beloved first wife Anastasia died. Ivan was convinced she had been poisoned by boyars, a claim modern forensic analysis of her remains partially supports, as they contained dangerous levels of mercury. His grief and suspicion transformed him. The reasonably effective, if strict, ruler gave way to someone far darker and more volatile. Ivan's personal tragedy coincided with the political setbacks of the Livonian War and the betrayal of his close advisor Prince Andrei Kurbsky, who defected to Lithuania and began writing snarky letters criticizing Ivan's rule. These combined blows seemed to break something in the Tsar's psyche. He became increasingly paranoid, seeing treachery everywhere and trusting almost no one. In 1564, Ivan did something truly bizarre. He suddenly left Moscow, taking a select group of his possessions, his treasury, and a few chosen boyars. He sent letters announcing his abdication, citing the treachery of the nobles and clergy. Moscow panicked. After weeks of confusion, representatives begged him to return. Ivan agreed, but with conditions he would have absolute power to punish traitors without interference from the boyars or the church. Thus was born the Oprechina, one of history's most terrifying secret police forces and a government system of institutionalized terror. Ivan divided Russia into 2 parts, the regular realm Zemshchina and his personal domain, Oprechina. He created a personal army of Oprechniki, black-clad enforcers who rode with dog heads and brooms attached to their saddles, symbolizing their mission to sniff out treason and sweep Russia clean of traitors. These weren't your typical intelligence operatives with subtle methods. The Oprechniki operated like a combination of a death squad, organized crime syndicate, and apocalyptic cult. They dressed in black, took monastic-style vows of loyalty to Ivan personally, and were unleashed to terrorize anyone suspected of disloyalty. particularly targeting the boyars who had humiliated Ivan in his youth. The resulting reign of terror reached its peak in 1570, when Ivan became convinced that the city of Novgorod was plotting to defect to Lithuania. He personally led the Oprichniki in a 5-week massacre of the city's population. Thousands were tortured and killed, with many thrown into the Volkhov River. Witnesses reported that so many bodies clogged the river that it couldn't flow properly. When he returned to Moscow, he continued the purge, executing supposed Novgorod sympathizers in increasingly creative and brutal ways. Ivan's mental state continued to deteriorate. He would swing between periods of extreme piety, praying for hours, making pilgrimages, and donating to monasteries, and episodes of shocking cruelty and debauchery. He would torture and execute people, then spend days begging for divine forgiveness, only to start the cycle again. It's like he was constantly toggling between the settings of repentant monk and serial killer, never finding a healthy middle ground. His personal life was equally chaotic. Ivan married at least 7 times. Some sources suggest it might have been 8, flouting the Orthodox Church's limit of 3 marriages. When his 3rd wife became ill, he apparently planned his next marriage before she was even dead. Several of his wives died under suspicious circumstances, leading to rumors they'd been poisoned when they fell out of favor. The most infamous moment of Ivan's personal life came in 1581, when he struck his pregnant daughter-in-law during an argument, causing her to miscarry. When his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him about this, the Tsar flew into a rage and struck him in the head with his scepter, essentially a metal-tipped staff. The blow killed the younger Ivan, leaving the Tsar's unfit younger son Fyodor as heir to the throne. In a moment of uncontrolled anger, Ivan had effectively doomed his dynasty. It was the royal equivalent of totaling the family car and then setting fire to the insurance policy. By 1584, decades of hard living, stress and possible mercury treatments for syphilis had taken their toll on Ivan. As his health declined, he grew increasingly interested in astrology and prophecy. Legend has it that soothsayers predicted he would die on March 18th, and Ivan, determined to cheat fate, rescheduled all March 18th activities. Feeling smug about outmaneuvering destiny, he set up a chess game on that fateful day, only to collapse and die while preparing to make a move. The date? March 18th. Even death, it seems, wasn't willing to negotiate with Ivan the Terrible. Ivan's legacy is complicated. On one hand, he laid the foundations for the Russian Empire that would dominate Eastern Europe for centuries. He centralized power, expanded Russian territory significantly, and created governmental and military institutions that outlasted him. Many Russians today see him as a strong leader who modernized the country and stood up to the privileged boyar class. On the other hand, his paranoid second half undid many of his earlier achievements. The Oprichnina decimated Russia's administrative class and terrorized the population. The failed Livonian War drained the treasury and cost Russia territory rather than gaining it. His killing of his own son led directly to the Time of Troubles, a period of famine, war, and chaos that followed his death as his unfit son Fyodor ruled briefly before the dynasty collapsed. Modern historians have suggested various explanations for Ivan's dramatic personality shift, ranging from mental illness to the effects of mercury poisoning. Some even speculate he might have suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy or a personality disorder. Whatever the cause, the transformation was so dramatic that it's almost like Russia was ruled by 2 different people who happened to share the same body. Ivan the Terrible stands as one of history's most paradoxical rulers, a nation builder and a nation destroyer, a modernizer and a medievalist, a man capable of both visionary leadership and unhinged brutality. His contradictory legacy reminds us that history's most influential figures are rarely simple heroes or villains, but complex individuals whose greatness and terribleness are often 2 sides of the same coin. 2 centuries before Peter the Great would force Russia toward Western modernization, Ivan had already set his country on the path toward becoming a major European power, even as his later paranoia and cruelty undermined that very mission. While later rulers would build gleaming new cities and win glorious victories, none would match Ivan's dramatic impact on Russian identity and governance. He created the template for Russian autocracy that would endure for centuries, centralized, powerful, and always with a hint of terror lurking beneath the surface, proving that sometimes the most terrible rulers are the ones who leave the most lasting mark on their nations. John Adams was the original guy who follows the rock star. Imagine spending your career as the opening act for the Beatles, then finally getting your shot at headlining, only to discover everyone's comparing you to John Lennon, while Paul McCartney is sitting in your cabinet planning to run against you. That was basically Adams' life after Washington. The American Revolution needed different kinds of heroes. It needed flashy, charismatic figures like Jefferson, with his fancy words, and Washington with his imposing presence. But it also needed the irritable, brutally honest workhorses like Adams, brilliant legal minds who would stay up all night, drafting boring but essential documents, while others gave the inspiring speeches. Adams was the guy who made the trains run on time before trains were even invented. Born in Massachusetts to a family of modest means, Adams wasn't born into the aristocratic wealth that cushioned many founding fathers. He worked his way up through sheer brain power and stubborn determination. As a young lawyer, Adams even defended British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, a deeply unpopular move that showed his lifelong commitment to the principle that everyone deserves a fair trial. The trial was essentially Adams saying to an angry mob, "I know we all hate the British right now, but we can't just skip the whole justice thing when it's inconvenient." Spoiler alert, he won the case, which probably made him simultaneously the most respected and most annoying man in Boston. Adams was like the friend in the group chat who keeps sending paragraph-long responses when everyone else replies with emojis. While Thomas Paine was writing catchy revolutionary slogans, Adams was writing dense legal arguments. He wasn't winning any popularity contests, but the revolution needed his brain as much as it needed Washington's leadership. During the Continental Congress, Adams emerged as one of the most forceful voices for independence. While others waffled, Adams pushed relentlessly forward. He nominated Washington to lead the Continental Army in a brilliant political move that helped unite the colonies. Adams served on more committees than should be humanly possible, basically becoming the revolution's chief bureaucrat. Not glamorous work, but someone had to do it. While Jefferson got credit for writing the Declaration of Independence, it was Adams who fought like a bulldog to get it passed. Jefferson might have had the poetry, but Adams had the persistence. The two had a fascinating relationship, sometimes the closest of friends, sometimes bitter rivals, always bound together by the extraordinary times they lived through. They were like those two friends who are constantly arguing but secretly respect each other more than anyone else. After independence, Adams was shipped off to Europe as a diplomat. In England, he had the awkward job of representing the nation that had just broken up with them. Imagine showing up at your ex's house asking to borrow some sugar, and also recognition as a sovereign nation. Adams somehow managed it with a blend of dignity and his characteristic bluntness. The British didn't like him much, but they respected him. When Washington became president, Adams found himself as vice president, a role he famously described as the most insignificant office ever invented by man. Basically, his job was to break ties in the Senate and otherwise stay out of the way. For someone as opinionated and energetic as Adams, it was pure torture. It was like casting Jack Black in a movie and telling him to stand quietly in the background. Then in 1796, Adams finally got his shot at the top job, winning a narrow election over his supposed friend Jefferson. He inherited a mess. The young nation was being pulled into European conflicts. Political parties were forming despite Washington's warnings, and Alexander Hamilton was undermining him from within his own party. Add to that the impossible task of following Washington, and Adams faced the political equivalent of being asked to babysit a sugar-hyped toddler during a hurricane. The biggest crisis of Adams' presidency came in the form of an undeclared naval war with France, the XYZ affair. French officials demanded bribes just to talk to American diplomats, triggering outrage across the United States. War fever swept the nation. Most presidents would have ridden that wave straight into conflict. It would have been politically advantageous for Adams to declare war on France. His popularity soared when he initially took a tough stance. But here's where Adams showed his true character. Despite enormous pressure, he risked his political career by seeking peace. He sent new diplomats to France against the wishes of his own party. The result? A peaceful resolution that probably saved the fragile young nation from a war it couldn't afford. Adams later considered this his finest achievement, writing that he wanted his gravestone to read, "Here lies John Adams, who took upon himself the responsibility of peace with France in the year 1800. His finest moment became his political undoing." Adams' peace moves alienated the powerful Hamiltonian wing of his party, while failing to win over Jefferson's supporters. The Alien and Sedition Acts, passed during the war scare, damaged his reputation among those who championed free speech. These controversial laws made it harder for immigrants to become citizens and criminalized criticism of the government. a terrible look for a nation founded on liberty, and a move that contradicted Adams' own principles. Political pressure makes people do strange things, and Adams later regretted supporting these measures. The election of 1800 became one of the ugliest in American history. Adams was portrayed as a wannabe monarch with a hideous hermaphroditical character. Jefferson's camp spread rumors that Adams planned to marry one of his sons to a daughter of King George III to create an American royal family. Meanwhile, Adams' supporters called Jefferson an atheist, a radical, and a coward. American political discourse has always been a dumpster fire. It just used fancier language in the 1800s. Adams lost the election to Jefferson in what became the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political parties in modern history. That alone is an achievement worth celebrating. Adams could have contested the results or used his remaining power to sabotage Jefferson. Instead, he accepted defeat and quietly departed Washington, D.C. before dawn on Jefferson's inauguration day. He wasn't being petty, well, maybe a little. He simply couldn't bear to watch his frenemy take the office he had lost. In retirement, Adams devoted himself to writing and farming. The stream of letters between him and Jefferson, once they reconciled in their final years, provides some of the most insightful reflections on the founding era. These two old rivals, once bitter enemies, found their way back to friendship through intellectual respect and shared history. They were like the original political odd couple, working through their differences one letter at a time. In one of history's great cosmic coincidences, both Adams and Jefferson died on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Adams' last words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives," not knowing Jefferson had died hours earlier. It was as if neither could outlive the other, their fates intertwined to the very end. Even death couldn't resist a bit of dramatic symbolism when it came to these two. Adams never had Washington's universal adoration or Jefferson's poetic genius. He wasn't the most likable founding father. He was vain, stubborn, and brutally honest to the point of social suicide. But his contributions were enormous. He gave everything to the American experiment, often receiving little thanks in return. John Adams represents something essential about democracy. It's not always pretty, it's not always graceful, but it requires dedicated people willing to do unglamorous work and make unpopular choices. In a revolution full of dreamers, Adams was the practical one, making sure the dreams had a fighting chance of becoming reality. History hasn't always been kind to Adams. He lacks Washington's monuments or Jefferson's memorial. But in many ways, Adams represents the truest version of American democracy. Imperfect, argumentative, driven by principle but subject to human flaws. He wasn't born to wealth or blessed with natural charisma. He succeeded through sheer intelligence, hard work, and stubborn belief in the rule of law. So next time you're stuck doing the necessary but unglamorous work while someone else gets the glory, remember John Adams. The revolution needed its Washington, but it also needed its Adams, the grumpy, brilliant workaholic who kept the whole enterprise from falling apart. Not all heroes wear capes. Some just write really long, persuasive letters and refuse to shut up until justice prevails. Thomas Jefferson was America's original Renaissance man, a walking contradiction wrapped in Enlightenment ideals and human failings. Imagine if Elon Musk, William Shakespeare, and Bernie Sanders somehow merged into one person who also happened to own slaves while writing about freedom. That barely scratches the surface of Jefferson's complexity. The man was obsessed with gadgets. His home at Monticello was basically the 18th century equivalent of a Silicon Valley tech bro's smart house. Jefferson installed doors that opened automatically, a wine dumbwaiter, a rotating dinner table for faster food service, and even a clock powered by the weight of cannonballs. He redesigned the entire place multiple times just because he kept thinking of improvements. Jefferson was the original guy who couldn't stop tinkering with his surroundings. Born into Virginia's planter elite, Jefferson received the kind of education most could only dream of. He devoured books like modern teenagers devour social media, becoming fluent in multiple languages and studying everything from architecture to zoology. His mind was a browser with an infinite number of tabs open, all running simultaneously without crashing. As a young lawyer and politician, Jefferson quickly established himself as someone with a way with words. When the Continental Congress needed someone to draft the Declaration of Independence, they turned to the tall, awkward redhead from Virginia. While John Adams served on 987 committees approximately and fought political battles, Jefferson quietly crafted one of history's most influential documents in a rented room. He was like that group project member who says nothing during meetings, but then delivers a perfect final presentation. What makes the Declaration extraordinary isn't just its political importance, but its poetic power. Jefferson didn't just list grievances against King George III. He created a philosophical framework for a new kind of nation. The phrase, "all men are created equal," has echoed through history, challenging each generation of Americans to live up to its promise. Unfortunately, Jefferson himself would fail this challenge in spectacular fashion. After helping birth the nation, Jefferson served as Washington's Secretary of State, where he quickly became Alexander Hamilton's arch-nemesis. Their cabinet battles were the original political rivalry: East Coast versus South, banking versus agriculture, strong federal government versus states' rights. Hamilton and Jefferson were the Batman and Joker of early American politics, each believing the other would destroy everything good about the Republic. Jefferson lost to John Adams in the 1796 presidential election, becoming vice president in an awkward arrangement where the electoral runner-up got the second highest office. Imagine losing the competition for CEO but being forced to become deputy CEO anyway, reporting to the person who just beat you. Workplace tension doesn't begin to describe it. The election of 1800 changed everything. After a bitter campaign and an electoral tie with Aaron Burr that forced the House of Representatives to decide the winner, Jefferson finally claimed the presidency. His victory represented the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political parties in modern history, a democratic achievement that deserves more celebration than it gets. The revolution that began with muskets continued with ballots. As president, Jefferson's first term was nothing short of brilliant. He slashed the national debt, reduced the size of government, and doubled the size of the country with the Louisiana Purchase, arguably the greatest real estate deal in history. For 3 cents an acre, Jefferson acquired 828,000 square miles of territory from France, instantly transforming the United States from a coastal nation into a continental power. Napoleon needed cash for his European wars, and Jefferson was smart enough to say yes before the French emperor could change his mind. It was like finding Manhattan listed on Craigslist for $24 and a bag of beads. Oh wait, that actually happened too. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't without controversy. Nowhere in the Constitution did it explicitly allow for buying massive chunks of territory from foreign powers. Jefferson, normally a strict constructionist who believed in limited federal authority, suddenly found himself making a rather expansive interpretation of presidential power. When opportunity knocks with 828,000 square miles of prime real estate, principles sometimes take a back seat. Jefferson was like that friend who lectures everyone about healthy eating and then demolishes a pizza at 2 a.m. when nobody's watching. Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to explore this new territory, launching what became one of history's greatest road trips. Their expedition was part scientific mission, part diplomatic venture, and part epic adventure. Jefferson gave them a shopping list of things to look for that included woolly mammoths, which he thought might still roam the western wilderness. The fact that they didn't find any prehistoric elephants was probably his biggest disappointment. Jefferson's second term proved far more challenging than his first. His attempt to remain neutral in the Napoleonic Wars by imposing a trade embargo devastated the American economy while failing to change European behavior. It turns out telling American merchants they couldn't trade with anyone was about as popular as canceling Christmas. Jefferson learned the hard way that economic warfare has casualties on both sides. The most profound contradiction in Jefferson's life was his relationship with slavery. The man who wrote that all men are created equal owned over 600 enslaved people during his lifetime. He recognized slavery as a moral catastrophe, calling it a hideous blot and a deplorable entanglement. Yet he never found the courage or financial discipline to free more than a handful of enslaved people, remaining economically dependent on forced labor until his death. Most troubling was Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who was the half-sister of his deceased wife. DNA evidence now confirms what had long been rumored. Jefferson fathered at least 6 children with Hemings, beginning when she was a teenager. Their relationship lasted decades in a power dynamic so unequal it defies modern understanding. Jefferson apparently compartmentalized this relationship from his public philosophies about liberty in ways that seem impossible to reconcile. After leaving the presidency, Jefferson retired to Monticello, where he founded the University of Virginia, designed its buildings, created its curriculum, and selected its faculty. Never one to think small, Jefferson didn't just donate money to education, he built an entire university from scratch based on his vision of learning free from religious doctrine. It was like someone today saying, "I don't like the existing colleges, so I'll just build my own," and then actually doing it. Jefferson's spending habits were legendary for all the wrong reasons. He lived well beyond his means, buying fine wines, books, art, and furniture, while his plantation consistently lost money. By the time he died, Jefferson was so deeply in debt that his family had to sell Monticello and many of his possessions. The man who managed the nation's finances couldn't handle his own checkbook. It's a reminder that brilliance in one area doesn't guarantee competence in all others. In his final years, Jefferson reconciled with his old friend and rival John Adams. Their correspondence represents one of history's great reconciliations. Two founding fathers who had become bitter political enemies, finding their way back to friendship through intellectual respect and shared history. Their letters covered everything from politics and philosophy to aging and death. These weren't just two old men reminiscing. They were consciously creating a record of their revolutionary generation for posterity. In history's most dramatic mic drop, both Jefferson and Adams died on July 4th, 1826. Exactly 50 years after the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson went first, with Adams following hours later, still unaware of his friend's passing. It was as if they had scheduled their exits to coincide with the anniversary of their greatest achievement. Even in death, Jefferson had a flair for the symbolic. Jefferson requested that his tombstone list only 3 accomplishments: author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Notably absent was President of the United States. Jefferson considered his philosophical contributions more important than his political power. In an age of relentless self-promotion, there's something refreshing about this selectivity. Jefferson remains America's most enigmatic founding father, brilliant visionary and moral compromiser, champion of liberty and lifelong slaveholder, strict constitutionalist who made exceptions when convenient. He wrote that all men are created equal while failing to live up to that ideal in his personal life. He championed the common man while living as an aristocrat. He advocated Republican simplicity while accumulating massive personal debt through luxury purchases. Yet Jefferson's vision of America as a nation built on ideals rather than bloodlines or religion has proved remarkably durable. His words have inspired freedom movements around the world. The Declaration's promise continues to challenge Americans to create a more perfect union. Each generation has found in Jefferson both inspiration and warning, a reminder that even the most brilliant minds can be blind to their own contradictions. So next time you find yourself holding contradictory opinions or failing to live up to your own ideals, remember Thomas Jefferson, the genius who imagined a better world while falling tragically short of his own vision. The distance between his words and actions doesn't invalidate the power of his ideas. It simply reminds us that human beings are complicated, and progress comes not from perfect people, but from imperfect ones who nonetheless reach for something better. James Madison was America's original big brain in a tiny package. Standing at a whopping 5'4" and weighing about 100 pounds soaking wet, Madison was the physical opposite of the towering George Washington. Think of him as the political equivalent of a pocket-sized supercomputer. Small, unassuming, but capable of running the most complex calculations of government ever attempted. While Jefferson had the poetry and Washington had the presence, Madison had the blueprints. If America were a tech startup, Washington would be the charismatic CEO, Jefferson the visionary marketing genius, and Madison the chief engineer quietly coding the entire operating system that would make everything actually work. Without Madison's back-end work, the American experiment would have crashed faster than Windows Vista. Born to wealth in Virginia, Madison received an elite education, cramming 4 years of study at Princeton into just 2 years. The man was essentially a political science machine, devouring books on history, law, and government like they were potato chips. While other young men were out enjoying themselves, Madison was inside reading about the failures of ancient republics and taking extensive notes. He was that student who makes everyone else look bad by studying during spring break. By his mid-20s, Madison had already helped write Virginia's state constitution. By 36, he was the intellectual force behind the US Constitution. That's like inventing social media while your peers are still figuring out their career paths. Madison didn't just participate in creating America, he was the primary architect of its governmental structure. Not bad for a guy who was so small that his political opponents mockingly called him Little Jemmy. The 1780s were a disaster for the newborn United States. Operating under the Articles of Confederation, the country was basically 13 squabbling siblings with no parent in charge. States printed their own money, raised trade barriers against each other, and generally acted like they were independent countries rather than parts of a union. The situation was so bad that Massachusetts had to put down a rebellion of angry farmers. America was the trust fund kid who blew through their inheritance in record time and now faced bankruptcy. Madison recognized that without a stronger central government, the American experiment would fold faster than a cheap lawn chair. Working with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, he wrote a series of essays now known as the Federalist Papers, basically an extended marketing campaign for the proposed Constitution. Madison wrote 29 of these essays, often at a pace of one every few days, without Google or even a decent library at hand. The man was dropping constitutional wisdom like a political mixtape. At the Constitutional Convention, Madison took detailed notes of the debates while simultaneously being one of the primary participants. This was like being both the star player and the sportscaster for the same game. His Virginia plan became the foundation for the new government, though he had to compromise on many details. Madison wanted proportional representation in both houses of Congress, but smaller states objected so vigorously that the Senate was created with equal representation to appease them. Madison wasn't thrilled, but he understood that getting 70% of what you want is better than getting 0% because you refuse to compromise. Madison's greatest invention was the system of checks and balances that prevents any branch of government from becoming too powerful. He designed a government that would essentially pit ambition against ambition, using human nature's less attractive qualities as a feature rather than a bug. Madison figured out that the best way to prevent tyranny wasn't to hope for virtuous leaders, but to create a system where power automatically restrains power. It was government design that accounted for the reality that people will always try to grab more authority if left unchecked. In the software world, this would be like creating a program that automatically patches its own security vulnerabilities. Ironically, Madison initially opposed adding a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, arguing it was unnecessary and potentially dangerous to list some rights but not others. However, when it became clear that the Constitution wouldn't be ratified without these protections, Madison not only changed his position but became the primary author of the amendments. The ability to acknowledge when he was wrong and adapt accordingly was one of Madison's most admirable qualities. How many people do you know who would fight that hard for something they initially opposed? After helping create the Constitution, Madison served in the first Congress, where he was essentially the floor manager for getting the Bill of Rights passed. He then became Jefferson's Secretary of State, before winning the presidency himself in 1808. Madison's pre-presidential resume was so stacked that becoming leader of the free world almost feels like an afterthought in his biography. It's like finding out the person who invented the internet also spent 8 years as President of the United States. Unfortunately, Madison's presidency wasn't nearly as successful as his constitution writing career. His administration was dominated by increasing tensions with Great Britain that eventually led to the War of 1812. Madison had spent decades arguing that republics were more peaceful than monarchies, only to find himself declaring war for the first time in American history. Life comes at you fast in international relations. The War of 1812 is sometimes called America's Second War of Independence, though it might more accurately be described as a sideshow to the Napoleonic Wars that neither side fully won. For the British, fighting America was like dealing with an annoying mosquito while wrestling a lion named Napoleon. For Americans, it was an opportunity to prove they weren't going to be pushed around anymore. The war started badly for the United States. American forces attempting to invade Canada were defeated so thoroughly it was embarrassing. The British Navy blockaded the coast, strangling American trade. And in August 1814 came the ultimate humiliation. British troops marched into Washington, D.C. and burned most of the public buildings, including the White House and Capitol. Madison became the only sitting U.S. president to come under enemy fire in a war, narrowly escaping capture as the British entered Washington. His wife, the indomitable Dolly Madison, famously saved a portrait of George Washington before fleeing the White House. While James was out trying to rally militia troops, Dolly was making sure America's cultural heritage didn't go up in flames. Talk about relationship goals. He's trying to save the government while she's saving national treasures. The burning of Washington was America's rock-bottom moment, but things improved from there. American naval victories on Lake Champlain and Lake Erie turned the tide. The British, exhausted from fighting Napoleon, decided this side conflict wasn't worth the trouble. Both countries signed the Treaty of Ghent, essentially agreeing to return to pre-war conditions right before Andrew Jackson's troops demolished a British force at the Battle of New Orleans. That battle actually occurred after peace had been declared, but news traveled slowly in the 1800s, giving Americans a feel-good victory that completely changed the narrative around the war. Despite its dubious military outcome, the War of 1812 had significant effects. It cemented American independence in a way the Revolutionary War hadn't quite managed. It sparked a wave of nationalism and convinced many Americans that their experiment in self-government might actually survive. It also effectively ended the Federalist Party, whose members had opposed the war so strongly that some had even discussed secession. The Hartford Convention, where New England Federalists met to air grievances about the war, concluded right as news of Jackson's victory at New Orleans arrived, making them look like unpatriotic complainers rather than principled objectors. After leaving the presidency, Madison retired to Montpelier, his Virginia plantation, where he continued to think and write about Republican government. He remained deeply engaged with public affairs, advising his presidential successors and offering his thoughts on constitutional interpretation. When Virginia's legislature asked him about nullification, the idea that states could invalidate federal laws they disagreed with, Madison firmly rejected it, arguing that the Supreme Court, not state legislatures, had the final say on constitutional questions. The man who had once advocated for states' rights recognized that taking that principle too far would destroy the union he had helped create. Madison outlived most of the other founding fathers, giving him the chance to shape how Americans understood their own constitutional history. He carefully edited his notes from the Constitutional Convention and arranged for them to be published after his death, providing future generations with an invaluable inside look at the creation of the American government. It was like leaving behind the director's commentary track for the Constitution. What made Madison truly remarkable wasn't just his brilliant mind, but his lifelong willingness to adapt his thinking based on evidence and changing circumstances. He began his career as a champion of states' rights, but recognized the need for a stronger central government. He initially opposed a Bill of Rights but became its primary author. He started as a protege of Jefferson, but developed his own distinct political philosophy. Unlike many ideologues, Madison was willing to change his mind when reality demanded it. Madison stands as proof that physical stature has nothing to do with historical impact. The smallest of the founding fathers cast the longest constitutional shadow. Every time the Supreme Court issues a ruling, Congress passes a law, or the president exercises executive power, they're working within the system Madison designed. His fingerprints are all over American government, even centuries after his death. So next time you're feeling underestimated because of your appearance or overlooked among more flamboyant personalities, remember James Madison, the unassuming intellectual giant who built the operating system for the world's most enduring republic, while barely tipping the scales at 100 pounds. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one with the most profound impact on history. James Monroe was the political equivalent of that friend who shows up to the party exactly when all the drama has died down, but the good vibes are still going strong. After the revolutionary chaos of Washington's era, the bitter partisan battles under Adams and Jefferson, and the burning of the White House during Madison's watch, Monroe cruised into office when America was finally catching its breath and feeling pretty good about itself. His timing was impeccable. Talk about falling upward into the presidency. While Jefferson was drafting fancy declarations and Madison was engineering the Constitution, Monroe was bleeding on battlefields. As an 18-year-old student at the College of William and Mary, Monroe dropped out to join the Continental Army when the Revolution broke out. This wasn't a strategic career move or a way to avoid studying for finals. The British were literally marching through Virginia. Monroe joined up and quickly found himself at the Battle of Trenton, where he nearly died after taking a musket ball to the shoulder. Washington himself found the bleeding Monroe on the battlefield, potentially saving his life. Nothing bonds you with the future first president like him personally making sure you don't bleed out in the snow. That battlefield credibility served Monroe well throughout his career. While Jefferson and Madison were known for their brains, Monroe was respected for his character and judgment. He wasn't the sharpest intellectual of the founding generation, but he had something equally valuable: rock-solid common sense and unimpeachable integrity. Monroe was like that reliable friend everyone wants around when decisions need to be made, not the most exciting person at the table, but the one you actually listen to. After the Revolution, Monroe practiced law and entered politics, quickly rising through the ranks from state legislator to U.S. senator. In 1794, Washington appointed him minister to France, a job that turned out to be more complicated than anyone expected. Monroe arrived in Paris during the bloodiest period of the French Revolution, when the guillotine was working overtime. The French warmly welcomed Monroe, seeing him as a fellow revolutionary, and he responded with perhaps too much enthusiasm, openly embracing the French revolutionary government while Washington's administration was trying to maintain neutrality. This diplomatic faux pas got Monroe recalled from France. Imagine being fired by George Washington. That had to sting. But Monroe bounced back, becoming governor of Virginia and eventually working his way back into Jefferson's good graces. When Jefferson needed someone to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, he sent Monroe to France as a special envoy. Monroe and Robert Livingston managed to buy 828,000 square miles of territory from Napoleon for about 3 cents an acre, still the greatest real estate deal in history. Monroe went from being fired as a diplomat to helping double the size of the United States. That's quite the career rehabilitation. Monroe's diplomatic adventures weren't over. Madison appointed him Secretary of State, where he had to deal with the deteriorating relationship with Great Britain that eventually led to the War of 1812. When the war went badly and the British burned Washington, Madison added Secretary of War to Monroe's responsibilities. Imagine having 2 cabinet-level jobs simultaneously during a national crisis. It was like being both the fire chief and the police commissioner during a citywide emergency. By 1816, Monroe was the obvious choice to succeed Madison as president. He won the election handily, and 4 years later was re-elected with every electoral vote except one. A New Hampshire elector cast a ballot for John Quincy Adams, supposedly because he wanted Washington to remain the only president elected unanimously. That elector must have been fun at parties, the historical equivalent of the guy who intentionally ruins a perfect game in baseball for the sake of trivia. Monroe's presidency coincided with a unique period in American history known as the Era of Good Feelings. After the War of 1812, Americans felt a surge of nationalism and pride. The Federalist Party had essentially collapsed, leaving Monroe's Democratic Republicans as the only significant political force. For a brief shining moment, American politics wasn't defined by bitter partisan divisions. It was like that week in college when all your roommates paid their share of the bills on time, and nobody ate anyone else's labeled food from the fridge. Of course, this era of good feelings wasn't good for everyone. Monroe, like his Virginia predecessors, was a slaveholder who did little to challenge the institution. Native Americans continued to be pushed off their lands as white settlement expanded westward. And beneath the surface of national unity, sectional tensions between North and South were building over issues like tariffs and slavery. The era of good feelings was good primarily for white Americans who benefited from westward expansion and economic growth, a reminder that national nostalgia often overlooks who was left out of the supposed golden age. The defining foreign policy achievement of Monroe's presidency was the Monroe Doctrine, announced in his 1823 State of the Union address. This policy declared that the Americas were closed to further European colonization, and that the United States would consider any European interference in the Western Hemisphere a hostile act. It was breathtakingly ambitious for a nation that was still relatively weak militarily. Imagine a teenager who just got their driver's license announcing rules for the entire neighborhood. The Monroe Doctrine was less about what America could actually enforce, and more about what it aspired to become, a continental power with its own sphere of influence. Interestingly, the Monroe Doctrine was largely drafted by John Quincy Adams, Monroe's Secretary of State and the next president. Monroe himself was content to present the policy while letting the brilliant Adams handle the details. This was Monroe's leadership style in a nutshell. Identify talented people, put them in positions to succeed, and take a collaborative approach rather than needing to be the smartest person in the room. It's a management technique that has aged considerably better than powdered wigs and knee breeches. Domestically, the biggest crisis of Monroe's presidency was the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the first major political battle over the expansion of slavery. When Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state, it threatened to upset the balance between free and slave states in the Senate. After intense debate, Congress reached a compromise. Missouri would enter as a slave state, Maine would enter as a free state, and slavery would be prohibited in the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase territory north of latitude 36°30. Monroe signed the compromise, temporarily diffusing the crisis. But the debate revealed the deep division that would eventually tear the country apart in the Civil War. Jefferson, watching from retirement at Monticello, called the Missouri Crisis a fire bell in the night that filled him with terror. Monroe, more optimistic by nature, hoped the compromise would provide a permanent solution. History would prove Jefferson right, as it often did. After 2 terms as president, Monroe followed the example of his predecessors and retired from politics. Unlike Jefferson and Madison, who retreated to their Virginia plantations, Monroe found himself facing financial ruin. Decades of public service had prevented him from managing his plantation effectively, and he had spent large sums of his own money on official entertainment as president. Congress eventually voted him $30,000 in compensation for his expenses, but it wasn't enough to solve his financial problems. Monroe was forced to sell his Virginia estate and move in with his daughter in New York City. The man who had negotiated the Louisiana Purchase and proclaimed the Monroe Doctrine died nearly broke on July 4, 1831, the 3rd president to die on Independence Day, following Jefferson and Adams 5 years earlier. There's something poetically American about a founding father who expanded the nation's territory and influence, ending his days in financial distress. Even history's main characters aren't immune to money problems. Monroe is often overshadowed by the more intellectually dazzling founders like Jefferson and Madison, or the more dramatic figures like Washington and Hamilton. He wasn't the best writer, the most original thinker, or the most charismatic leader of his generation, but his consistent good judgment, personal integrity, and steady hand at the helm during a crucial period of national consolidation made him exactly the president America needed after the turbulence of its early years. In many ways, Monroe represented the transition from the revolutionary generation to the antebellum era. He was the last president who wore the old-fashioned revolutionary attire, the knee breeches, silk stockings, and buckled shoes that had gone out of style. On a diplomatic tour of the country in 1817, Monroe caused a stir by appearing in these outdated clothes, like a time traveler from the 1790s. Yet his policies looked forward, not backward, laying the groundwork for American expansion and influence in the 19th century. Monroe was also the last of the Virginia dynasty that had dominated American politics since independence. After him, power shifted to a new generation of leaders from different regions, with different visions for the country's future. The era of good feelings wouldn't last, as Andrew Jackson's populist movement and the growing sectional crisis over slavery would soon introduce a new, more combative style of American politics. So next time you hear that someone is presidential material, think of James Monroe, not necessarily the flashiest or most brilliant person, but someone whose sound judgment, personal integrity, and ability to work well with others allowed him to lead effectively during a crucial period of national development. Sometimes what a country needs isn't a revolutionary visionary, but a steady hand who knows how to keep the ship on course after the storm has passed. John Quincy Adams was America's original Nepo baby. Imagine having your dad's face on money one day while people are still alive who remember him changing your diapers. Talk about pressure. Being the son of founding father and second President John Adams meant expectations higher than a giraffe's eyebrows, but somehow JQA managed to both completely bomb as president, while also being one of the most impressive Americans who ever lived. His life story reads like a bizarre political roller coaster built by someone with no understanding of physics. Little John Quincy got a head start on life that would make today's helicopter parents look negligent by comparison. While other colonial kids were playing with sticks and rocks, 7-year-old John Quincy was tagging along with Dad on diplomatic missions to Europe. By age 14, he was serving as private secretary and French interpreter for an American diplomat in Russia. When you were 14, you were probably trying to figure out how to talk to your crush without spontaneously combusting. John Quincy was helping negotiate with Catherine the Great's empire. His education was so thorough, it would make modern Ivy League grads look like they attended the University of Keeping It Simple. Adams spoke 7 languages fluently. He could translate classical Greek before breakfast, debate political theory over lunch, and still have energy to discuss astronomical mathematics at dinner. The man was basically Google Translate and Wikipedia rolled into one powdered wig-wearing package 2 centuries before either existed. After Harvard, Adams became a lawyer, though his heart was never really in it. Being a corporate attorney isn't exactly thrilling when you've already helped negotiate international treaties as a teenager. It would be like asking Simone Biles to join your local gym's beginner tumbling class. The legal profession was too small for his ambitions. Washington appointed the 26-year-old Adams as minister to the Netherlands, making him America's youngest ever diplomatic envoy at that point. His father was serving as vice president at the time, but nobody seemed concerned about nepotism, possibly because John Quincy was more qualified for international diplomacy at 26 than most people would be after 3 lifetimes in politics. When John Adams became president, he kept his son in diplomatic service, eventually appointing him minister to Prussia. Some critics cried nepotism, but Washington had appointed young Adams first, and his qualifications were unquestionable. Still, working for Dad had to be awkward. Imagine your performance review coming from the guy who used to scold you for not eating your vegetables. After the election of 1800 ended his father's presidency, John Quincy returned to America and was soon elected to the Massachusetts State Senate, then the U.S. Senate. Despite being the son of a Federalist president, Adams found himself increasingly at odds with that party's policies. When he supported Jefferson's controversial Louisiana Purchase and embargo against Britain, Massachusetts Federalists were so outraged, they essentially forced him to resign from the Senate. Adams had committed the cardinal sin in politics, thinking for himself instead of following party lines. Madison appointed Adams as minister to Russia, where he spent years freezing in St. Petersburg, while representing American interests during the Napoleonic Wars. He later helped negotiate the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812. Adams then served as Monroe's Secretary of State, generally considered the most successful phase of his political career. He was the primary architect of the Monroe Doctrine, warning European powers to keep their imperial ambitions out of the Western Hemisphere. It was diplomatic swagger from a nation that barely had a standing army, like a chihuahua barking territorial warnings at a pack of wolves. The presidential election of 1824 was a four-way disaster with Adams, Andrew Jackson, William Crawford, and Henry Clay, all competing. Jackson won the popular vote and had the most electoral votes, but failed to secure a majority, throwing the election to the House of Representatives. Clay, who came in fourth, threw his support behind Adams, who then won the contingent election. When Adams promptly appointed Clay as his Secretary of State, Jackson supporters cried corrupt bargain, claiming Adams had bought the presidency by promising Clay a cabinet position. Whether or not there was an explicit deal, the appearance of impropriety tainted Adams' presidency from day one. It was like starting a marathon with your shoelaces tied together, while everyone else gets a head start. Jackson and his supporters spent the next 4 years portraying Adams as an illegitimate president who had stolen the election from the people's choice. As president, Adams was essentially the political equivalent of that person who brings a chess set to a monster truck rally. His goals were noble but completely misaligned with the populist mood of the 1820s. He proposed an ambitious program of internal improvements: roads, canals, a national university, an astronomical observatory, all funded by the federal government. He envisioned America becoming a scientific and cultural powerhouse through federal investment, decades before such ideas would become politically feasible. Congress essentially responded to these proposals by laughing Adams out of the room. Jackson's supporters controlled Congress and blocked virtually everything Adams tried to accomplish. They weren't about to let this illegitimate president claim any victories. Adams' presidency became a 4-year exercise in frustration as he watched his ambitious agenda die in legislative committees. The 1828 election rematch against Jackson was vicious even by modern standards. Jackson's supporters portrayed Adams as an elitist intellectual out of touch with ordinary Americans who spent taxpayer money on gambling devices for the White House. The gambling device was actually a chess set and a billiard table Adams had purchased with his own money. Meanwhile, Adams' supporters attacked Jackson's wife Rachel so viciously that Adams himself was disgusted by his own campaign. Rachel died shortly after the election, and Jackson blamed the stress of the campaign attacks for her death. Not exactly a shining moment in American political history. Jackson won in a landslide, and Adams left the White House as a one-term president widely considered a failure. Most politicians would have retreated into bitterness or a comfortable retirement. Not John Quincy Adams. In the plot twist no one saw coming, he ran for the House of Representatives in 1830, the only former president in American history to serve in the House after leaving the White House. It would be like a former CEO taking a middle management job just because they genuinely believed they could do more good there. What followed was the most remarkable post-presidency in American history. Adams served 17 years in the House, becoming the nation's most outspoken opponent of slavery at a time when merely discussing the issue was taboo in Congress. Southern representatives pushed through the gag rule, prohibiting even the discussion of anti-slavery petitions, specifically to silence Adams. But old JQA had discovered something in his 60s that had eluded him as president: his political fighting spirit. He waged a relentless 8-year battle against the gag rule, using parliamentary procedure, constitutional arguments, and sheer stubborn persistence to challenge it at every turn. The man who had seemed aloof and inflexible as president became a master of legislative guerrilla warfare, finding creative ways to bring up slavery despite the rule. When Southerners tried to censure him, he turned the proceedings into a referendum on free speech that embarrassed his opponents into backing down. He wasn't just burning the political rulebook, he was using its ashes to write a new one. In 1841, Adams achieved his greatest post-presidential triumph in the Amistad case before the Supreme Court. He successfully defended a group of enslaved Africans who had seized control of the slave ship transporting them and sought their freedom. Despite being in his 70s and not having argued a case in decades, Adams delivered an eloquent argument that helped secure the Africans' liberty. It was like watching a retired baseball player return to hit a grand slam in the World Series. Throughout his House service, Adams kept detailed diaries just as he had his entire life. His journals span 68 years and provide one of the most comprehensive first-hand accounts of early American history. The man documented everything, including his daily swims in the Potomac River. He was possibly America's first skinny dipper-in-chief, swimming nude in the river at 4:30 every morning. Decades before presidential security details would have had collective heart attacks at such behavior, Adams literally died on the job. In February 1848, while speaking in the House chamber, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. Colleagues carried him to a couch in the speaker's room, where he died 2 days later, closing a public service career that had begun before the Constitution was written. His last words were reportedly, "This is the last of Earth. I am content." How many people get to script their own perfectly dignified exit line? The supreme irony of John Quincy Adams is that his greatest failures ultimately revealed his greatest strengths. His political rigidity and unwillingness to engage in backroom dealing made him an ineffective president in the rough-and-tumble politics of the 1820s. Yet those same qualities, his moral certainty and refusal to compromise on principles, made him the perfect congressional champion for the abolitionist cause in the decades before the Civil War. Adams lived long enough to serve alongside a young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, creating a direct link between the founding generation and the president who would ultimately fulfill Adams' vision of a United States without slavery. It was as if history had arranged for a torch-passing ceremony between two pivotal eras of American politics. John Quincy Adams defies easy categorization. He was simultaneously an entitled child of privilege and one of the hardest-working public servants in American history. He was a failed one-term president and also one of America's most important diplomats and moral leaders. He was politically tone-deaf yet capable of legislative brilliance. He was the son of a president who made his own distinct mark on history. So next time you think someone's best days are behind them, remember John Quincy Adams, the man who bombed as president, only to reinvent himself as a congressional badass fighting against slavery in his 70s. Maybe none of us are ever too old for a spectacular second act. Andrew Jackson was essentially America's first experiment with letting pure chaos occupy the White House. Imagine if Wolverine from X-Men somehow got elected president, complete with rage issues, questionable decision-making skills, and an absolute refusal to back down from any fight, no matter how unnecessary. The man was walking testosterone poisoning in a fancy jacket, and somehow Americans looked at this human hurricane and said, "Yes, let's put him in charge of everything." Born in the Carolina backwoods to Scots-Irish immigrants, Jackson's childhood read like the beginning of a supervillain origin story. His father died before he was born. During the Revolutionary War, a teenage Jackson was captured by British troops. When a British officer ordered Jackson to clean his boots, the boy refused, earning himself a sword slash to the face that left permanent scars. His brother died in the war, his mother died nursing revolutionary prisoners, and by 14, Andrew Jackson was completely alone in the world, with nothing but rage, determination, and a burning hatred of the British. If someone wrote this backstory for a movie character, critics would call it too on the nose. Despite minimal formal education, Jackson somehow taught himself law and became a frontier lawyer in Tennessee. This was less impressive than it sounds, Frontier law was basically just having a loud voice and knowing how to write your name. He built a successful career, acquired land and slaves, and married Rachel Donaldson after she separated from her first husband. Unfortunately, her divorce wasn't actually finalized, technically making their marriage bigamous, a scandal that would haunt them for decades and eventually contribute to her death. If Jackson had anger issues before, the attacks on his wife's character transformed him into a vengeance machine with a hair-trigger temper. Jackson fought in so many duels that historians have trouble counting them all. He carried bullets in his body from multiple shootouts, including one lodged near his heart from a duel with Charles Dickinson, who had insulted Rachel. In that encounter, Jackson deliberately let his opponent shoot first, took a bullet to the chest without flinching, then carefully aimed and killed Dickinson. The man literally just stood there bleeding so he could improve his aim. This wasn't strategy, this was frontier psychopathy, and somehow Americans found it charming. His military career made him a national hero. During the War of 1812, Jackson led American forces to a stunning victory at the Battle of New Orleans, completely annihilating the British despite being outnumbered. The fact that the battle occurred after the peace treaty had been signed, news traveled slowly in 1815, didn't diminish the psychological impact. Americans were euphoric that someone had finally given the British a proper thrashing. Never mind that the war itself was basically a draw. Jackson had delivered a decisive victory that allowed Americans to pretend they had won. A few years later, Jackson led military campaigns against the Seminole in Florida, essentially invading Spanish territory without clear authorization, executing 2 British subjects, and generally acting like international borders were just suggestions. Rather than court-martialing this loose cannon, President Monroe capitalized on the chaos by pressuring Spain to sell Florida to the United States. Imagine your employee completely ignoring protocol, and you giving them a promotion because their mistake somehow worked out. Jackson failed upwards better than anyone in American history. His first run for president in 1824 ended with him winning the popular vote, but losing the election when the House of Representatives chose John Quincy Adams instead. Jackson and his supporters spent the next 4 years essentially running the longest political revenge campaign in history, portraying Adams as an illegitimate president who had stolen the election through a corrupt bargain with Henry Clay. It worked spectacularly. In 1828, Jackson won in a landslide, and his supporters essentially turned the White House into a frat house during his inauguration, climbing in through windows, breaking furniture, and standing on expensive chairs in muddy boots. Jackson had to escape the mansion to avoid being crushed by his own admirers. The establishment was horrified, which only made Jackson more popular with ordinary Americans. As president, Jackson approached governance like a bar fight, identify enemies, attack relentlessly, and never ever back down. He fired federal employees en masse and replaced them with his supporters, establishing the spoils system that would corrupt American politics for generations. When the Supreme Court ruled against his Indian removal policy in Worcester v. Georgia, Jackson reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it," essentially telling the Supreme Court to go pound sand. He vetoed more bills than all previous presidents combined, using the veto not as a constitutional safeguard, but as a political weapon. Jackson's most infamous policy was the forced relocation of Native American tribes from the southeast to territories west of the Mississippi. The Trail of Tears resulted in thousands of deaths as Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw people were marched westward under brutal conditions. It was ethnic cleansing with a thin veneer of legality, and it remains one of the most shameful chapters in American history. Jackson, who had built his career fighting Indians on the frontier, saw nothing wrong with disposing of entire civilizations to make room for white settlers and their enslaved workers. His battle with the Second Bank of the United States exemplified Jacksonian politics at its most theatrical. Jackson believed the national bank represented elitist Eastern interests and corruption. When the bank's president, Nicholas Biddle, applied for a renewal of the bank's charter 4 years early to force the issue during an election year, Jackson took it as a personal challenge. He vetoed the recharter, pulled federal deposits from the bank, and essentially declared war on the entire American financial system. Jackson's bank war epitomized his political appeal. He portrayed himself as the champion of ordinary people against corrupt elites. Never mind that destroying the central bank destabilized the economy and contributed to the Panic of 1837. Jackson had picked a fight with the ultimate symbol of establishment power and won. His supporters didn't need economic stability. They needed to see their guy punch the rich guys in the face. His presidency was also marked by the nullification crisis, when South Carolina declared federal tariffs void within its borders and threatened secession. Jackson, despite being a slave owner and Southerner himself, responded with characteristic subtlety by threatening to march an army into South Carolina and hang his own vice president, John C. Calhoun, who supported nullification. Jackson got Congress to pass the force bill authorizing military action while simultaneously supporting a compromise tariff. The crisis passed, but it foreshadowed the Civil War to come. Jackson's nationalism, temporarily papered over the deepening sectional divides his own political movement, had helped create. The man sustained more assassination attempts than any president until the 20th century. In the most famous incident, a house painter named Richard Lawrence approached Jackson with 2 pistols. Both misfired, at which point the 67-year-old president attacked his would-be assassin with a cane, beating him severely until aides pulled him away. Statistically, the odds of 2 pistols misfiring independently were about 1 in 125,000. Jackson was so rage-filled that he literally defied probability. After leaving office, Jackson returned to his plantation, the Hermitage, where he continued to influence politics through his chosen successor, Martin Van Buren. When he died in 1845, he had few regrets except, by his own admission, that I didn't shoot Henry Clay and hang John C. Calhoun. Just a normal, healthy attitude from a former president. Jackson transformed American politics by expanding the vote to all white men. Property requirements were eliminated during his era, while simultaneously denying humanity to nating the institution of slavery. He created the Democratic Party as a vehicle for populist rage against elites, established the imperial presidency by expanding executive power, and fundamentally changed Americans' relationship with their government. His supporters called this new approach Jacksonian democracy, though it might more accurately be described as Jacksonian white male democracy. Women, Native Americans, and Black Americans were explicitly excluded from Jackson's vision of democratic participation. His was a democracy of demographic hierarchy, where equality among white men came at the expense of everyone else. Jackson appears on the $20 bill despite hating paper money and destroying the national bank. This historical irony would infuriate him, which is perhaps the best argument for keeping him there. Though there have been efforts to replace his image with Harriet Tubman's, a delicious reversal that would put an escaped slave and Underground Railroad conductor in place of a slave owner, built his fortune on forced labor. Andrew Jackson remains one of the most consequential presidents in American history, a transformative figure who simultaneously expanded and contracted American democracy, a champion of the common man who owned human beings, a defender of the Union who empowered forces that would eventually tear it apart. He was America's first populist president, channeling the rage of ordinary citizens against established power, while wielding that same power like a cudgel against vulnerable populations. So next time a politician claims to represent the people against the elites while actually serving their own interests and those of their preferred demographic group, remember Andrew Jackson, America's original political chaos agent who turned personal grievance into national policy and convinced ordinary citizens that his enemies were theirs too. Jacksonian politics never really went away. It just keeps finding new targets and new champions with each passing generation.